Oh.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to a very special and early episode of the Sunday Stream. We are taking a break from our regularly scheduled programming of international affairs and geopolitical conversations, and instead I am joined by two very special guests and amazing people. I am joined by Gio and Lev, the hosts of the Break the Rules podcasts. Gio, Lev, welcome to the show.
Thank you so
Good to
much
be
for
here.
inviting us. So why don't you start?
Cross-shilling, cross-promotion.
I was just gonna say, like Tim and Eric, Gio, why don't you start and then I'll interrupt you.
Okay. Oh God. Usually it's the other way around. It's like 100% the other way around. Yeah. So we do BTR and we want to grow. We're the one. I think like okay, apart from like certain other places that don't do it well, they have a certain niche of like internet blood sports, but what we're doing is like one of the last true variety shows on the internet. We're like the McLaughlin group for Zoomers, pretty much. I mean, that's pretty, yeah. So we bring in people that are semi-mainstream, and we bring in like weird internet people that could probably get those semi-mainstream people fired and canceled. So so coming on BTR is kind of like throwing a hand grenade into your career, pretty much. So that's.
Well,
Yeah.
the way that I see it, though, is that the career for a lot of people in media in general is going to be going the way of the dinosaur, or at least it's not going to be as it's not going to be as prevalent as it was before. Like, look at all these old ass institutions: New York Times, the New Yorker, New York Post, New York Magazine.
If you can't tell, Lev is from New York City.
Yes, well, I was originally, so a bit of a background on me. I was originally born in St. Petersburg, Russia, and my family and I fled here to the United States of America, good old US of A. And it's actually very interesting that the time that we came here, this was still around Dinkins era, so this was like 93. And the time that we came here, and what New York is turning into now, I think it's starting to cross in right now. It's a very interesting time in New York City. Interesting in the bad way. You know, a lot of rampant crime, a lot of crazy people walking the streets, stabbing everybody. But anyway, this is when we got here to New York City. But regardless of all the stabbings and things of that nature, what I really like, or what we really liked about New York and America in general, from the impression that we got from it, was that unlike Soviet or post-Soviet Russia, everybody wanted to help us out. Like pretty much everybody. Like when we were there, people helped us out, moving our furniture and giving my grandmother directions. So it was an interesting mix. Like there were people, you know, these youths, these rapscallions who, you know, went around and took things from people and assaulted people. And at the same time, you had people that were absolute mensches, people who would give you the time of day and help you out. And my hope is that through, like we were going to be talking about good governance today, my hope is that we would be able to figure out a way to have more of this, sense of honor that people that we encountered in America had to a much greater extent than the people that were left behind in Russia.
Wow.
Well, I think this is the first, because I've heard you tell the story a few times now on the podcast, but I think this is the first time that you've really gone into detail. So I appreciate you sharing that, Lev. And I think that's a good segue to sort of talk about where we were last week, because last week was sort of this conversation about the future of governance, and we had some rather interesting characters on.
Yeah, interesting.
Yes, that is definitely the right way.
Well, that's the same. Like when my mother came here, that's like they literally had like just found someone that spoke Italian like when they first came to Canada. So it's sort of like, I mean, I think the whole thing with immigration is obviously different now. I mean, the romanticism around it is become another sort of weapon of political control, as we've seen, you know, during the Trump years. But anyways, yeah, good governance. So we have this stream for those who don't know, but I'm pretty sure most people watching the Prudentials probably watched that stream, because it was like, it's very rare you see someone who has interacting with people that are like outside of what you would call the autonomous global political class. I don't know, Prudentialist, what was your impression? That's what I was curious. What did you think of the whole?
Well, first, let me tell you who was there, just so we have a roster
There you go.
in our minds. So we had Garrett Jones on, and Garrett Jones is the author of 10% Less Democracy, a very interesting book. And we also had Indian Bronson, whose Twitter handle is against GOP. And we had, of course, the Prudentialist on, and we had Mark Terrell on. And I think Mark Terrell was the person that everybody was focusing their view on. And he is the founder of Undavos, author of Scaling, and he is a WEF, not to be confused with what's the wrestling WWF? WEF, World Economic Forum, Tech Pioneer, 2008. And as I found out, as we were talking about in the show, he was responsible for strategizing certain things that ended up happening in relation to Syria, the wars in Syria, and in relation to Libya, the overthrow of Gaddafi. But specifically, the things that he told us that he was working on was having to, let's say, minimize casualties in whatever situations were happening there, which again, like on its face, something like that, like I wouldn't have a problem with that as far as somebody who is in the position where, you know what, at least I can help minimize the amount of damage. My only problem is when it comes to somebody being in that position in the first place, do you have, in a way, responsibility to, when you're there, say, you know what, this is absolutely awful. I condemn everybody doing like anything of this nature, and I'm going to protest against it by virtue of being here. Or I'm going to talk to my friends and their wives and their coworkers and just kind of get them to see that this is not a good thing to even be a part of. You know, like, where does one's responsibility lie, even if you are trying to save lives, when it comes to minimizing that damage? So I'm curious, like, I don't really have a good answer for this, but Prudentialist and Geo, what do you guys think? And also, Sneed super chats. Prudentialist must grow, and you are going to make him grow with the super chats that you are going to send us. So anyway.
Are you the host of this stream?
Apparently. You know,
That's so natural.
The meme from, I know it was so well done. It was just an excellent transition to shill. But no, like, you know, the meme with Chris Pratt from Parks and Rec. This is where my inner Gen Z 1995 millennial is going to come out. I didn't grow up watching The Simpsons. I did not. So yeah. Like, I am vaguely familiar with the whole Sneed meme, and I'm just like, oh, I wish I knew what this was, because I grew up watching like Armed Forces Network because my father was in the military. So it's just like, what the hell is The Simpsons, and what the hell is all these like reference me? I was just like at this, and I'm like that Chris Pratt meme from Parks and Rec, where I'm like, at this point, I'm too afraid to ask.
Yeah, that's.
Do you like? By the way, do you like my invisible bottle?
I do,
because it's green. That's my old man. That was his favorite episode because it had the line, "You couldn't grow stink off a monkey." So that was, and then Homer's like, the shopkeep, he's like, oh, you can't grow anything there because the pH is over 9. He's like, oh, that's old wives. That's an old wives' tale. So it's like everything that farming does is like just superstition, but he's telling it. Well, I'm explaining the joke. Yeah, I think it's really weird how I think it's indicative of the way things are going. Like if you watch the stream, the real contention that people have is with this air of like the impersonal technocracy is like father knows best, the order of the father, but it's more like mother knows best nowadays. But it seems that that's what people really find kind of disturbing, even if you have like the best intentions. Like I remember Mark, he was talking about how it's like, yeah, I just called up some friends and we gotta like fix this problem, and it's really sort of kind of weird, crazy, like inversion of the American, I guess you could call it, like the American ethos of like problem solving, like the whole, you know, what was the FDR program, the what was it, the during the Great Depression, the New Deal. It's sort of like that spirit of like the American Reconstructionist period of, you know, we're problem solvers and we're going to get it done. And it's like, you know, the muralist art in the post office of the Giga Chad engineer next to the Giga Chad farmer, sort of the American regionalist stuff. It's got that sort of same spirit, but now it's like these, what would you say? I mean, you could use any adjective, Eloy, bugmen, whatever, right? Like whatever reactionary sort of slang.
Although here's what I want to do though, Gio. I do want to push back on that slightly, where I think Mark he's a strategist. He has a specific role that he does. Now, as far as the people who command him to do a certain kind of role, what I'm curious about here is how many people within the establishment, whatever you want to call it, are the impression that you got from Mark versus people who still have a sense of honor. So I don't even know the answer to that yet, and I'll tell you why I say that. Because I think a big problem with the side of Twitter that looks at all of these things that we talk about in a very doom and gloom way, and I'm not saying that they're right or they're wrong yet. What I'm saying is that they look at it in this very doom and gloom way, and my problem is that I think that they assume that everything that they see people say comes from what they actually believe, as opposed to being part of something bigger and something more nuanced. So if a person goes out and says, like Trump, for example, says what he said about the migrants, that's going to give him certain flack and is going to be, let's say, less able. He's going to be less able to do certain things behind the scenes as he would have been able to do if he would have kept his mouth shut. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to apply to everybody, but I wish that people would, let's say, for the sake of, just for the sake of thinking a little bit differently about this, imagine that not every politician who's going to come out is going to say exactly what's on their mind, and that there may be some people, even people within the Democratic Party, let's say, who actually don't want to live in the kind of hellhole that de Blasio wants to create. And in a way, they're trying to control this giant beast in such a way as to have things level off and to actually have a certain amount of order be brought back in. But if they actually say what their plan is, then it's not going to work. Then you're going to have all these people coming out of the woodwork and attacking them.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like, you really can't. I mean, even the question of governance itself, we really have, like, it's a very easy heuristic to talk about the personal virtue or the personal agency of anyone who has connections and who are a part of these networks. But really, the way that things are structured nowadays, it's almost as if you could have the best intentions in the world, but you're still going to get swallowed up by the Leviathan. So again, really, this almost reminds me, and Prudentialist, you talked about this as well, the sort of failure of conservatism in America to just like solely rely on electoral politics as if that's going to like make a difference in terms of political power in the grand scheme of things. Because these institutions, unless some kind of like dramatic, like doomsday optimist scenario comes about, the way that things are going, I mean, even someone like Mark Terrell, he could like talk in these sort of very personalized terms, but that's not truly grasping what's going to happen on the ground and all of the decisions that are made. There's almost like an impersonalized force that are involved in a lot of these institutions, not to get like, Nick Land on you, like the whole like, sentient force of capital or whatnot. But it almost is like nowadays we're being subjected to a lot of like very impersonal forces that are out of like the hands of human agency itself. And it's just like, as government gets more sort of like internationalized and sophisticated and run upon various algorithms that can quote unquote streamline all of being into certain econometrics, then the sort of brakes on the whole machine is going to become so like deep and buried within it that it's virtually impossible to reverse course. Again, like unless unless the solar flare hits or whatever, I don't know.
But it also reminds me of what people were saying, and you could say, well, they were also right. What people were saying during the modern era when it comes to machinery, and we get all these films like Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times when he gets swallowed into the gears of the machine and things like that. So people were making allusions to exactly what you were talking about in previous epochs.
It's funny but I mean Chaplin, because his film. Oh, sorry to cut you up, Pranesh, but really quickly, his film, The Dictator, is basically like the worldview of the Bugman, in my opinion. It's like the proto-Bugman worldview. But anyways, that one speech that every Redditor thinks is like so profound about, it's basically John Lennon's Imagine.
I was just about to say, it was kind of like John Lennon's Imagine.
Sorry, Prudentious, we cut
you off. But like you brought up a good point, Gio, is that just like to even address the question of governance, I feel needs to sort of address the bigger question of the room, which is almost like chicken or the egg, which is about, if there's the question of virtue, when there's a question of like even what Lev brought up about honor and like the basic human decency, that sort of requires you to address the cultural problem first and before you can even get to governance. And so the question becomes just like, okay, over the last 70 years, we've seen this ongoing trend of like increased atomization. And I mean, you can even go back to like Charlie Chaplin, which is well over, 70 years talking about like atomization of the industrial world. And so you've got this widespread atomization, a reduction of community. We've had the development of a managerial class, which has swallowed up virtually every local and decentralized school, newspaper, and institution, which makes it harder for you to have a community-based identity. And we've now watched since the era of nuclear weapons, which this is one of my, concerns sort of from a reactionary perspective, is that, okay, that means more and more government has been ceded to an executive branch, which has been growing in its bureaucracy, which is almost impossible to hold accountable because Congress will write shell legislation that simply directs some nameless bureaucrat within the executive to write policy. And so we go to the courts for our politics. So electoral politics really doesn't matter. So to a point,
not even military power anymore.
Well, not even military power either. But that's a conversation for a whole. That could be a whole other stream.
The one Marine like with the trans soldier and Ted Cruz. And it's funny that you have your family is a military background, Prudentials, because I think I think it was Bronze Age Pervert that said that they just want to like outright purge any sort of like what they did in Germany, any sort of like latent reactionary force within the military. And like, it's really, true.
But they're already doing that, right? Like they're already beginning to scan social media. The guy who I think he had some sort of comment about like an officer's bra size and he got fired.
God.
I mean, we have that guy's whole Space Force thing where he criticized cultural Marxism and he got fired, and Jack Posobiec's been shilling him the same way he's shilling Mark Lindell's My Pillow. But it's just...
Yeah, and how does that work out for Posobiec every time he has these fallen martyrs on of cancel culture?
I mean,
like that's,
they make, I don't know. I mean, I think that he's been able to keep Mark Lindell's business afloat, so whatever works for him.
Yeah.
But I mean, to respond to a comment, electoral politics does affect the courts, but at the same time, when a lot of our major political issues, right? So like, electoral politics can affect things like the courts, yes, but like, there's no way that a national legislature like the U.S. Congress, right? They'll say they'll take up things like guns or abortion. They know damn well that they're not going to have the political wherewithal to like take it on head on, and they're going to pray that the courts do something instead. It's this sort of kicking the can down the road is what I'm referring to.
Well, even Oh, go ahead, Lev.
Well, I just want to push back a little bit because, again, otherwise we're all going to be agreeing with each other till the cows come home, and that's the exact thing that I'm against. And I don't want to push back for the sake of pushing back. I generally think that there are things here that may not have been as considered. For example, if you go outside and actually talk with people, like most people, I'd say, like, even though there's economic problems and things like that, and there is this sense of, how did you phrase it? There, atomization, as was used a lot of times. I do find that people are generally still very friendly, and there are certain things that end up happening that push people together. For example, during the 2003 blackout, and sure, you could say, oh, that was 2003. That was, no, was it 2003? Yeah, it was 2003. During the 2003 blackout, there were, I remember people who were, again, helping out my mom who had to like walk barefoot because she had on the heels and those ended up breaking off, and everybody was helping each other as much as they could. And that was because there was chaos going on, and people got a sense of togetherness and community when the chaos was happening. You could say that when the chaos is not there, that ends up breaking down. But at least it still shows me that if we're not talking about the politicians, if we're not talking about all these members of decision makers, the actual people on the ground, that quality that I was talking about differentiates America from the USSR. I think that quality is still inherent within the people. Again, the people who are not stabbing other people and the people who are not crazy. Everybody else, like everybody who kind of like remains there, who's also like not a crazy leftist, I think that those people would be able to endure whatever, let's say, problems are going to exist thanks to the courts, thanks to whoever is going to be in power. And eventually, I think that's going to create a certain amount of weakness within that system, which would bring in some new blood into it eventually. And I could be wrong about that, but I'm still kind of looking at the ground, looking at the people who I meet going outside, speaking to them, and not really seeing the loud minority that you end up experiencing when you're on Twitter or when you hear the mouthpieces of these very extremist groups that somewhat have hijacked our electoral process to an extent. And again, not everybody, but the loud ones are the ones that you end up hearing from the most.
Yeah, but the problem is that, I mean, especially like, for example, I mean, you know, my country up north, most people are getting fed up with like a lot of things like the lockdowns but what are you going to do about it? Because, well, I guess Canada is different because we have an even greater like impersonal managerial state that has entrenched itself in everyday life and people just accept it. But like, for example, the courts, I remember when they were doing the Kavanaugh thing when he got elected, or I don't know how it works. Like he got appointed. Sorry. He went through the process. They wanted to do this thing where just because we don't like a certain judge, we're going to put him in some kind of like limited state where his opinions don't have as much weight as like, I don't know, Sotomayor or someone like, or they'll just add more judges. So that's kind of like, it's very a self-defeating sort of thing to rely upon electoral politics.
But if it goes down, Gio, if it goes down in New York, let's say, because using my city again, and by the way, there is a little bit of an echo. I'm not really sure where it's coming from. But if it goes down here, then that's going to be a very important lesson to the New Yorkers that end up staying in here. Like they have certain policies, for example, with the hotels that, from what I understand, they still are allowed and even encouraged to bring in homeless into some of the hotels in the Upper West Side because the government ends up paying for that. So they don't want people to know about it. They want it to kind of be on the hush-hush, but people do see the effects of that. And so my hope is that New York gets a good slap in the face the next years or so. I don't know who they're going to elect mayor. If it's going to be somebody that's going to enact law and justice, then things are going to get better quicker. But again, if the New Yorkers are going to be a bunch of idiots and they're going to continue the same cycle that they did with de Blasio, then they get what they deserve. They're going to feel the pain, and they're going to learn from that pain. Taste the pain. Yeah, they're going to learn from that pain, and that's the only way you can grow. This is why I think that countries in Eastern Europe are going to be a lot more, they're going to be a lot more ready for challenges to come because they've lived under communism. They know what that's like, unlike the wine-sipping Euros of France and the
continental bar. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, the Continentals, because they're a bunch of naive children, and they're also going to learn the hard way. They're going to learn the hard way when it comes to migration, and I think they've already shown. I don't see that many people with like a refugees welcome sign. So I think that they are already learning the hard way. And Eastern Europeans learned the hard way before with being under Soviet occupation. They don't have to learn as much now. They're better educated. And I think this is kind of like a cycle that people have to go through. Same thing, for example, with equality in terms of men and women. What I've been seeing lately, and I could be wrong about this to a certain extent, depending on where you look, but in the Nordic countries, I know we talk about like Captain Sweden and things like that, but I do think in the Nordic countries, they've kind of understood now that there are certain jobs that men want to do more than women and vice versa, and they're not pushing it as much. And I think the reason for that is because it's already been tried out, and there's already been a certain amount of time where women could say, okay, like we've had our shot at going into these places that we were excluded for. Now it's not that much of a forbidden fruit. So my other potential prediction here is that certain things that are still forbidden fruits right now, like let's say girls going into the Boy Scouts and things of that nature. Let them have their fun, and eventually, if they don't find that it's that edgy anymore for them, it's that, oh, we're going to smash the patriarchy. Like, if all that ends up just being boring and mundane, then I don't think they're going to seek it out as much, and the pendulum is not going to swing as far. Now, you are definitely free to disagree with whatever I said right now, but I'd be interested in you considering that a little bit, the potential of all of this stuff to just go away based on people having the freedom to do a lot of the stuff that, let's be honest here, it was like how many decades when a lot of this stuff having to do with like men and women working equally and all these various other things that we see right now being just like absolutely propelled at us by the machine. How many of these things, if we're honest with ourselves, decades ago were things that were not allowed for women or were like heavily discouraged? So in a way, like, I think that these policies that we made in the past created an enemy within. And right now, the enemy within, like Kali, is just going nuts and chopping people's heads off and sticking their tongue out. And eventually, I think Kali is going to relax. Now, that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be work that has to be done when it comes to places like New York City for, again, the slap in the face of all the stupid, naive New Yorkers as far as who they vote for. I want them to be taught a lesson. But regardless of that, I think that some of these big movements that we're seeing right now are going to eventually wither away, because I do see them as being the swing of the pendulum to the other side. Because, again, there were certain things that were restricted for people way back when. And I don't think it's something that you can just say like, oh, that never happened. We're just going to be equal from, right here. And we're not going to implement anything to, let's say, bring more women in or bring more whatever you want in. But the question is the timeline. Like, where would you say you have to have a timeline? Like, how many more years are we going to keep that going until that's it? We're not going to implement any of these policies anymore. We've had our opportunity to bring people in, and now we can just judge everybody according to their merit.
So I think that brings us to back to the question, because I mean, like, you have a point, Lev, when we talk about sort of just everyday people, and I think that's why, to me, it's very important that we don't ignore that phrase, like touch grass. And like I know that gets memed to death on internet circles, but to me, I think it's important, and I talked about this in a previous video, that you can't lose sight of what's in front of you. And you kind of have to appreciate what's in front of you. And if you're lucky, say, like, for instance, I live in a rural area. Like, I'm lucky to live in a very high trust, sort of community. The importance of localism, I think, is going to be very important to sort of accomplish those things and to have those conversations about what is good government. But the problem, I think, that is that you have watched, and at least in the last 30 years, right? Like, critical theory comes around in the like late 70s, early 80s, takes over academia within about 30 years. And then 5 years after that is in, most public schools. It's now in the media. Every commercial is, got a very anti-majoritarian sort of perspective. And so to me, unless you start looking locally, and unless you start acting locally, trying to take on the behemoth or the Leviathan with one spear, like, unless that spear, penetrates all that blubber and you take out Moby Dick with one fell swoop, congratulations. I don't think that's ever going to happen. So I think people need to think wisely about what they want and what that looks like, which is good governance. And for me, at least from what I've noticed in my personal experience, and this is where I've had a lot of debate with other people on my sort of side of politics, is about sort of that conversation about what do you do going forward, and what do you do about activism, and what do you do about engagement. I firmly believe, at least here in the United States, locally, it is still incredibly accessible. Like, I lived in a very blue city for a very long time. I grew up in El Paso. But like, getting involved politically was not at all hard. And I mean, all you have to, and like what Mark Terrell was talking about being practical and actually just making some phone calls. Like, that's where I agreed with him, despite the fact I couldn't stand his politics and like the fact that he came off as sort of like the ultimate midwit bugman. To me, what it was telling of, to me at least, was that he knew that all you had to do was go out there, find the room of people, shake your hands, and start talking to people. And I was reminded of this thread on Twitter. I don't know who it was that was talking about it. And he's just like, Nick Fuentes, for example, he argued that Nick would be a much bigger force in American politics if he, rather than trying to piss off Charlie Kirk, had played nice with him, and he would have been the head of TPUSA within 5 years. And I'm like, I probably believe that.
Plus his name reminds me of Daisy Fuentes. You remember Daisy Fuentes?
No, but you know what? And about the driving force of any particular nation or civilization. I mean, I'm pretty tempted by a lot of anti-American arguments. The Great Satan, whatever. But what's the founding phrase? The three things of the sort of American spirit. What is it in the Constitution?
Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Right. Now, do you know what the one is in the Canadian Constitution? It's peace, order, and good governance, right? Because we have sort of a weird mixture of that American, liberalism, but also the British model of, for example, the Canadian frontier in the north. Order came to it through the crown and sort of ensuring that gold miners, for instance, or the Coeur de Bois, the fur pelt trappers, that they had enough supplies and so forth. Whereas we know this sort of, it wasn't exactly true, but the romanticized picture of the Turner thesis, the American frontier, that is the indelible sort of yeoman farmer spirit of America. And so we have two very different living side by side pictures. I would say that Canada is probably, the reason I bring it up is because that is, to me anyways, the model of, that's closer to the consensus among, what would you call it, the global liberal autonomous political class. That's much more further along than, for example, this residual spirit of Americanism that is still has this very romantic picture of self-reliance and the sort of rugged yeoman farmer and the frontiersman. Even though the frontier is still fundamentally closed, and it's closing, on the internet especially, there still is, I think, in America, a lot of people still have that spirit of self-governance that is against the norm. And if things start to slip up to the point where you can sort of go between the cracks of power, I think that probably you will see more people will move back to their old suburbs, and the suburbs themselves will become more ruralized.
It's already happening. It's already in progress right now. And I know that people say that the blue state people going to the red states will export.
Oh, that'll be a disaster in itself. That's another issue.
That's
but at the same time, at a certain point though, when too many areas start to become Detroit, I think the gears in the most impressionable liberal, and again, I don't want to use the word liberal here, but the most impressionable, bugman leftist would at a certain point have to start turning where saving their own skin would start to become a priority, and they'll start to get in touch with Maslow's hierarchy. But also, by the way, speaking of fantasy, you've just conjured up a fantasy in my head. Imagine after the apocalypse, there would be a return to fur trapping, but it would be furry trapping.
Oh, God. The Coeur de Bois, but for furries.
One can only dream. But here's my question though, right? Is that that's kind of already happening, and I'm concerned is that that this sort of waking up, and it's kind of like what brought Rudy Giuliani to power in New York City, right? I don't know if that can happen now, and the reason why I say that is for two reasons. Is that one is that I feel like what we are already observing is this really awkward doubling down.
Yes.
Especially in sort of now these sort of progressive cities that are even in red states, like Austin is now seeing a massive spike in crime, massive amounts of homelessness problem that you're seeing in the same way that you would see in San Francisco. People are talking about getting robbed in the nice parts of Austin or the nicer neighborhoods or in the nicer suburbs. But they're not, these people wouldn't vote for Greg Abbott. These people wouldn't vote for, Chip Roy. They're a Republican congressman. They would double down and they would argue, and we're already seeing this now, where you've got your sort of media types like Ezra Klein and Matthew Iglesias saying, well, and these kind of bugmen talking about how dare, the crime is going up, like heaven forbid. The worst thing imaginable is that Democrats look bad. This is where we're at. So the first problem I have is that, they'll double down, because the cultural impetus and the cultural, messaging that we have from the media, your education system, the popular culture, tells you that you are evil for pattern recognition. And then my second concern is that even if you were to get another Rudy Giuliani moment in sort of this awkward Maslow's hierarchy of needs, political realignment, whatever you want to call it, how long does it last? Because from my observation of history, right, is that history, so anytime that there's sort of this widespread reaction, there's the rebellion against that reaction is immense. So the reaction to sort of liberalism and the French Revolution, right? You get the Age of Metternich, and then the Age of Metternich is immediately met with the reaction of the revolutions of 1848.
Well, you also got Napoleon. Would you say Napoleon was also a reaction to the French Revolution, even though he said that he embodied the principles of the revolution and all that?
Well, I mean,
but that's
Napoleon's
in
an opportunist. I mean, Napoleon is a sort of Caesarian opportunist, and I actually kind of like Napoleon for infiltrating and taking advantage of sort of the rhetoric of the
well, that's what I'm talking about. That's the example.
But okay, so then my question to you, Lev, would be, do you think that kind of
with fireworks?
Well, no, I know. No. My question to Lev would be then, do you think even now, with all of this sort of atomization, sort of this anti-majoritarian, anti-white kind of talk that we see in the media and academia, how electoral politics have become basically nothing more than the friend-enemy distinction, do you think it is possible that you could convert or even get people to follow the lead of some sort of, figure like that, at least today?
I don't say figure, I would say figures. I think that the difference between the past ages and now is that certain things that would have worked in 300, 400, 500 years ago, where we could take a look at certain, let's say, dictators, for lack of a better word, that existed in the 1700s, 1800s, who would go in like Napoleon, establish the Napoleonic Code, right a lot of the wrongs. I am not sure that something like that would be able to exist. But there was a very interesting example that I was reading today in the book Aeon by Carl Jung. And he talked about how the Gothic cathedral idea of going up was later on replaced by going wide into the age of exploration with a similar energy, now not concentrated as much into going into the steeples right into heaven, but expanding outwards. And I think that this expansion outwards could potentially be seen in having a horizontal as opposed to a vertical elite of people who agree that they are fed up with a lot of the things that they are seeing and can start to make changes on the local level. I also see it in a way as a call to action for you, me, Gio, anybody who's listening to this. If you want to improve the conditions in terms of justice, in terms of good governance, like you talked about,
you have to get
in your local
you have to get
level.
some diesel and some fertilizer. Never mind.
In your local level, there are going to be people, when you actually start talking with them, as I did, people who I know in New York, people who, kind of like, they're Burning Man people. They're people that Moldbug would call the aristocrats. Not so much that they would, let's say, be the richest people out there, but at the same time, they are within the Blue Empire Society or whatever you want to call it. These are people who I've talked to in private who are sick to death of all the political correctness that's going on. And at the same time, there are also people that hate Trump with a passion. So it's an interesting thing where you could see people that are already getting fed up and that would put their hat into put their whatever analogy you want to use into figures that would be able to rise up, that would not be as polarizing in terms of what they say as Trump was. Because again, my whole thing here is that I'm pretty sure that there were people both on the Democratic and Republican side who, when listening to Trump talk about the migrants, they were thinking, dude, you just ruined our chances of creating the wall in secret. without all the wokes going against us. You know, like I'm sure that there were some people who were talking about that.
There's that Machiavellian.
There's that sort of the BAP thing about hide your power level and just play the game.
Which, I mean, sometimes I'm crossed with that because as an artist and writer, it's sort of like it's impossible to hide my power levels because it drips into everything. But at the same time, what you brought up with Jung, by the way, you stole my fire as a Jungian scholar myself.
I'm gonna go crazy, aren't I? When I'm reading Aeon right now.
I've been reading Jung, way before Jordan Peterson, by the way. What you said about Jung, that was very. I remember that one part in Aeon about how what can motivate a civilization to build something that they know they'll never see to completion in their lifetime. It's very similar, not to go too theory cell, but it's very similar to what Sloterdijk says in his monumental 3-part series about the sort of monoshapes of civilization, going from what he called the heliospheric, the one unisphere society, which you found in medieval Christendom, to then something of a horizontal level of like an expanding outwards, to now the age of foam, of the age of like micropolitics, where everyone is sort of circulated within themselves. It's very interesting to see the development, how civilization went from trying to reach the heavens, then trying to expand outwards, now trying to expand inwards. Because I think that the difficulty is that a lot of these forces that we're talking about is fundamentally predicated upon the sort of participatory aspect of internalizing a lot of these quote unquote modern values within yourself. And it's very difficult to sort of detach people from the quote unquote benefits of our particular civilizational arrangement. It's very hard to dissuade people from their autonomy, for instance. And it's very hard to divorce them from these things that don't necessarily have a direction or are being led by like a circle of tyrants or like a bloodlines of the Illuminati at the top. I mean, there probably is ancient bloodlines, but who knows, right? To me, it's interesting because when you get down to it, when you talk about, for example, Napoleon, he was a great man of history and he is admirable, but at the same time, he is one of the first millenarian dictators that is operating not on an expansion of a civilization state that is embodied usually within a particular religious arrangement, but now he is embodying sort of these detached Enlightenment principles of reason that can turn into the horrors of the 20th century even after him. So it's very difficult because, for example, like I'll give you an example. I was recently watching the Alex Kashuta interview with who's the guy, the Poly guy, that's the Evo Psych computer nerd. What's his name? Jeffrey Miller. That guy. God. He's got a lot of good ideas, but his whole point was that how can you take these things that were quote unquote good with previous civilizations, with previous religious-based societies, and how can you quote-unquote hack them to make this secular, ultra-utilitarian, post-rationalist sort of thing where you can reap the benefits of them, quote-unquote. To me, I think this is totally impossible. Like, you really can't get any sort of sense of organic community or like solving the fertility problem or whatnot, unless you have those fundamentally metaphysical values on a level that is deeper than just this maximization of human flourishing or happiness or whatever some big yud rationalist can theorize as being the maximization of good. Well, even when we asked Mark Turrell, what is your motivation? Because you don't believe in God or anything like that. It's like, he's like, well, I don't know. I want to do good in the world. It's like, well,
what's good?
Yeah, what's good, right?
I like this quote
from
Voltaire. I like this quote from Voltaire. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him.
I thought Nietzsche. Was that Voltaire?
That's Voltaire, and I completely agree with you that I don't really see there being a future without the recognition that there is something larger than us. I think it's inherent inside of people, this quality, and it's going to come through Black Lives Matter. It's going to come through whichever other religious movement, But here's a very interesting thing, though. Gio, I'm very curious about what you think of this. This is from Aeon. So, Christianity has insisted on God's goodness as a loving father and has done its best to rob evil of substance. The early Christian prophecy concerning the Antichrist and certain ideas in late Jewish theology could have suggested to us that the Christian answer to the problem of Job omits to mention the corollary, the sinister reality of which is now being demonstrated before our eyes by the splitting of our world. The destruction of the God image is followed by the annulment of the human personality. Materialistic atheism, with its utopian chimeras, forms the religion of all those rationalistic movements which delegate the freedom of personality to the masses and thereby extinguish it. The advocates of Christianity squander their energies in the mere preservation of what has come down to them, with no thought of building on their house and making it roomier. Stagnation in these matters is threatened in the long run with a lethal end.
Well, he's half right. I mean, the problem, like, again, this is very painful for me to admit, but Jung had a very problematic relationship to apostolic Christianity, and he, usually because his coming from his Lutheran background, his father was a Lutheran minister, he had a very controversial, almost like quasi-Gnostic opinions on things, like in his book that was in Aeon, Answers to Job. And so, but he is half right. I mean, what he was seeing, I think he wrote Aeon like in the 50s. It was one of his later books. He basically saw what was coming down the pipe in terms of that sentiment going into secularized, ultra-rationalistic ends, which at the end of the day, like, almost comes off as a sort of weird inverted metaphysics that is really infecting all life. I mean, you mentioned BLM, like there was a period where they were like legit, like reviving, like, doing a Wikipedia search of like African shamanic religions, and they were LARPing that. That was like their neo-pagan LARP. And so these things don't really go away. What they do, they just transmute into other inverted, bastardized forms. And so when I was hearing a lot, like when I hear a lot of these people that are very like, I guess, what we would call bugmen or whatever, they have a very almost like religious view of the world. And I know like the take that like wokeness is religious or whatever, I think that's kind of played out, but there still is something to that, in the sense that their picture of governance and the way the world should work is very much sort of like a closed, inverted metaphysical system, where now your own human agency becomes godlike in your ability to mediate all of the world's ills, or what you perceive to be the world's ills, into this very like transient, individualistic, self-created conglomeration of elements, rather than of true like self in like an ancient sort of, in any sort of like, religious arrangement where the self is something very solid and eternal. Now the self has become like this rhizomatic conglomeration of sinews. But I think that's wrong, because what they're selling, like they like to think that way, that they're like these romantic delusions that are going to like, if I take hormones, then I'm going to become a body without organs. They still want to replace the human with something that's very stultified, but
the self has turned into the selfie. And
yeah, exactly.
I like this. Yeah. I like this quote from The Last Temptation of Christ, where when Jesus encounters the Pharisees, who say, "Has God changed his mind about the old law?" Then Jesus says, "No, he just thinks our hearts are ready to hold more. That's all." Like, this is my whole thing when it comes to, and again, I want to be careful not to go into like the New Age route here, but I really see the planet Earth, when compared to all the other planets that are, around it in the sun, and then the star systems, galaxies, galaxy clusters, all this, I really see this whole existence as being kind of like an as above, so below, multi-layered onion, where the kind of beliefs that we hold right now are based on just the experiences, both like outer and inner experiences, that we have had in our very short lifetimes, and picking up the pieces of the people who were here and who died. I think it's still a very narrow grasp of what narrow grasp of what exactly may be going on. So I definitely see all the religious movements that have come and gone and some that have remained as being things that help to answer the question, sometimes may hinder the answering or veil the answer. But I generally do lean on there being a lot more to discover, kind of like what Jung was talking about, making things more roomy as you go along, as opposed to just keeping whatever it is that was passed down by the bearded fathers to you. You know what I mean? Like, it's this is my personal belief right now. I'm curious, like, what do you think there? Because I don't think we've seen the end of how much this will expand beyond the planet Earth into, you know, people are talking about the Galactic Federation and how we're not ready to join it up yet because we don't even know what space is. And like, look, I don't know if it's true.
You have to take drugs to go.
No, you don't. See, that's the great temptress over here. I generally believe that drugs are things like psychedelics. These are things that create a crutch for you and turn you into less of an agent. Your willpower cannot exert itself when you have drugs exerting their willpower for you. And I don't think that that's a good way of growing.
But notice how even that's become like chewed up in this, like these forces of commodification. Like you have like Silicon Valley tech bros who have like way more, microdosing, have way more power than any of us that are like, you know, treating these supposedly sacred things as if they're some way to like life hack your way into more productivity.
That's temporary temporal power. That's going to go
which
away.
I think brings us to reframe things back into the question, right? Because we're this point of religiosity.
Yeah, we got way off. Don't worry.
Wait. By the way, hold on. Before that, I just want to quickly read super chat from R. Millis Denat, who says trying to infiltrate the managerial class is simply trying to use Sauron's ring against him. I haven't yet seen it work. That is $10. Thank you so much, Armillis. Don't forget to subscribe.
We're on stream.
Lev, what are you doing?
What are you doing?
Lev.
Jeez.
Okay,
I appreciate it, but thank you. I'll get to his super towards the end. Don't worry.
No more. Okay.
Yeah. Lev, we're not on BTR. Love you,
God.
but we're not on BTR.
I'm very sorry.
It's
my
okay,
friend,
Gio.
he's got certain issues.
But to reframe things back towards the question of good governance, to get back on track, we are seeing sort of this sort of the old religion being devoured. We are seeing, and people say like, oh well, BLM is just sort of the Christianity LARP thing. I don't think that's been played to the end. When we saw Derek Chauvin get convicted, they were doing literal baptisms and revivals at the spot where he was killed. And I think what is indicative of what is to come is that I'm reminded of John Tano Mosca, the concept of political formula, which is how we generate, a political elite. The question becomes okay, we've identified whether you're, someone who doesn't like the current state of affairs, whether you're a reactionary, whether you're some sort of post-left, whatever. It doesn't, at that point in time, right? The question becomes, okay, we have a governmental system that clearly does not work, as Indian Bronson was talking about on last week's stream. We've got a ridiculous problem with suicide rates from the ages of 10 to 25 that has gone up exponentially in the last,
but that's just a small number.
But yeah, I know. And to which Mark Terrell just like brushed off, saying like, "Oh, well, you're just cherry picking." I'm like, hundreds of thousands of people are dead from suicide and death of despair, and that's cherry picking apparently. And that's my problem with this, the Bugman lack of sort of a teleological higher calling. But anyways, the point is that what I think needs to be developed now is a series of political formulas that would be a viable alternative. As much as a lot of people who are online like to, and I don't want to use the term LARP because I think there's good LARPing and bad LARPing. But for those who like to just sort of go online and be like, return and look at like 1950s advertisements, the whole, it's cool to be a McTrad, but I mean,
oh my God, that's an amazing term for it, bro. I love that. McTrad. It's like those Fash Wave edits where they notice how
where they'll take marble statues and then put it with like 80s synthwave or whatever.
Yeah, it was so easy to spoof because then you had edits where they were like, I can't get a girlfriend. I live in my mom's basement. It's like poorly drawn fast wave. And it's like, that's as soon as you're very easy to like sort of, and again, like all these people, like the Chad Westerner people, they've blocked me by now. Or so I've had this problem too, where when you become like ingratiated, like when you've become awe-inspired by like, decadent 19th century academic paintings instead of, sorry, I cut you off, Ernest. Sorry.
But yeah, so the question becomes, okay, you need to a creation of an alternative political formula needs to happen, because you can't go back to 1950. You can't go back to even 1850, right? Like my as much as my dream thing would be to like return to a pre-17th Amendment world where the direct election of senators didn't happen and like democracy was a lot more indirect. I know that that's most likely politically impossible in my lifetime because people are so culturally ingrained with this universal enfranchisement or whatever.
Yeah.
The idea, I think, at this point is to, one, recognize that this is sort of a long-term issue. I've been comparing it for as long as I've been online talking about this stuff. I think you need to compare it to the Reconquista. This is going to take a long time in order to get back to where we're at. The second thing is that you need to create a political formula that gives people a reason to hedge their bets against the current system, whether that's a disaffected elites or even the masses that will give them a reason to believe in something. I think that Christianity, of course, is going to play a big role in that as someone who is in term with his faith, but I know that's not for everybody. The values, however, of Christ's teachings, I think, will definitely live long past any sort of organized aspect of the religion.
Well, let me ask you, Prudentialist.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Then I'll ask you a question.
Okay. And then finally, I think what needs to happen after that is that don't expect to. I think infiltration of the managerial class has clearly not worked, because at that point in time, you start. Anytime that someone tries to play the game, you either become a part of the system, or the system can easily identify and treat it like, an infection or a bacteria, and the immune system works on it. I think that the way that you sort of bypass that, or you work around that, is that you start trying to delegitimize the system. And this is what my thought process was, at least in terms of maybe getting things on that track, was that, for instance, there was that debate between Destiny and what's his name, Mark Wolf, that big socialist professor.
Oh,
that a lot of
I watched that.
Okay,
that
it's very cringy. It's very
cringe.
But Wolf is that professor that almost all these bread tubers, Vosh and company, like to cite, right? Like they're the go-to appeal to authority academic. This is why socialism works. This is why all these like really weird Bugman atomizing ideas, hyper-capitalism ideas work, despite claiming to be a leftist. And he was BTFO'd by Destiny with his basic bitch liberal talking points.
Yeah, it's neoliberal sort of like economic, homo
exactly.
economicus, yeah.
And so to me, I'm like, cool. So clearly the academic class can be BTFO'd in sort of the world of online blood sports and almost groiped in a way. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, that's a potential strategy to start delegitimizing the system. Is to it's the academic class.
Yeah, and I guess the problem though is the people that were trying to do that, like, I'm going to, if you follow me long enough, my thoughts about a certain gripper general. The problem is that the people that are doing that, they didn't really have a direction. Like, yeah, it's fun to go after Charlie Kirk and mention the dancing Israelis or whatever, but like to really trip up people that are in these systems, it's almost advantageous if you don't really have like sort of a quote unquote reactionary background. It's something that, as much as it pains me to say that he's right about this one thing, I remember Sonny had this tweet where he's like, you should like start off as like a normie lib, then like you get fame as an artist, then you get canceled. And that's way more effective than, for example, what I'm doing, where people already know my politics, and I'll never get any position anywhere in their world.
Guess who else is kind of like that?
No way. I was going to mention
This guy.
Yeah, well, you too. Yeah. No, but for example, Jeffrey Schollenberger, and I'm not just saying this because I like him and he's my friend and I've been on his podcast. Of course, I am saying that because of those things. But someone like Jeffrey Schollenberger is 10 times more effective, I think, at delegitimizing a lot of these like blue checks or Chapo ironists that go after him online, because of the fact that he is a legit professor at NYU and he doesn't have the sort of stench of being a quote unquote reactionary. I mean, that's obviously the problem is the question of OPSEC. You know, a lot of people are on the right are distrustful of them.
No, but
I know,
why even?
that's another problem within itself, obviously.
Like, why be committed to being a reactionary at all? Because if we're talking about no, I'm serious. Because if we're talking about, I know, whoa, what's going on here? Huh? No, if we're talking about, if we're being real here, okay, real talk.
This is why I brought
whatever we want
Lev
to.
on.
Thank you, Prudentialist. Real talk. Whatever we want to imagine the world is like, I still think that inside of our minds, it's a bit of a cargo cult. Just like I see any religion as being somewhat of a cargo cult compared to higher knowledge that maybe a few people here and there may be able to attain within their lifetime. But more or less, it's still like going off what somebody has an idea of what is the real reality without necessarily most people knowing it. Same thing here. My concern is that whenever we look back at the good old days, we put our rose-colored glasses on and we imagine certain things which may not be as far off in terms of one's imagination as the things you guys were making fun of just earlier with the fash wave stuff. You know what I mean? Like, there is still somewhat of an element. My thoughts are here, and I could be wrong. I can't really go into your head right now, Prudentialist or Geo, but there may still be somewhat of an element of imagining like a nice trad life without like certain technologies that we have today. My concern here is that if any of you guys were actually teleported back then, you wouldn't last a day. I could be wrong about that, but it's like, if we are living in the environment we're living in right now, like, what can we take? What can we really take from the past that we want to integrate into the future in such a way that it is going to be the kind of life we would actually be able to live in and not be in a relative hellscape that it may actually be compared to what you may think it is.
And so this is where I'm glad that this is the question, I think, that brings us to the topic of the stream, because Lev is asking the question that I feel like a lot of people who are maybe kind of reactionary getter that you people see sort of online, where they're like, well, you know, oh, these people want to return to like being subsistence farmers in a feudal state and live under a vassal. And it's like, no, I don't think that that's what they're pining after. I mean, I'm sure that there are that do, and I think that maybe that's a bit of a LARP, but I'm not one to judge or to question their intentions. But I think the biggest thing that we've seen is that imagine for the fact that most of the world's technological development has happened so rapidly within the last 150 years, right? Radical changes to how humanity lived for the last maybe 4,000 years. So we're living under some unprecedented technological change, and which in turn has led to a lot of social engineering, a lot of manufactured consent, and a lot of erosion of what made traditional sort of life or trad life happen. So for instance, when people say, well, like, why be reactionary? It's because there are some cultural things that we can clearly identify that have caused problems. Whether that is sort of the elimination, and this is where I'll say a few things that are spicy here. So like the elimination of like black culture in the United States, like if you take a look at like the black family structure from like the 1960s, pre-LBJ's Great Society to now, holy crap, you've seen the entire destruction of like almost a civilization inside the United States within 2 generations. That's depressing. The elimination or the creation of no-fault divorce, which has destroyed the family and has created a lot of things that relate to the issues of hypergamy, have led to issues of the male-female divisions within our society. A lot of the issues that feminism tried to correct end up getting exacerbated through these sort of destructions there. Local decentralized institutions, so a pre-managerial technocratic class where you had local newspapers that took care of local news and reported on local events fairly or based on their needs. You know, these institutions that tried their best to put things out there. And so to me, it's incredibly concerning that there are clear identifiable problems that we have been talking about now for decades, but everyone likes to think that we can fit them in this sort of normie, liberal, you know, like, oh, if we just vote harder or if we just focus on the here and now, we can solve these problems. And it's like, no, there are clearly deviations from what has happened in the last 100 years that we can identify, not in a root cause sense, but at least to say, hey, this was the deviation point where things started to go a little screwy. And so when people ask me, like, well, how did you become this sort of like reactionary Nick Land reading Moldbug, like reading kind of person? And it's because I moved from a city in the world of Bugman to like this rural Christian living, loving community out in the farmland boonies, and realizing, holy hell, things are a lot better out here. And there are good things about that. Like, when I lived in El Paso, I had my girlfriend at the time was from Wyoming, and she moved in with me. And she was like, well, let's get to know the neighbors. And it's like, how are you going to get to know your neighbors? They don't speak the same language as you. They sure as hell don't like you. And what are the likelihood that you can rely on them if there's an emergency? There's this no trust. There's this low trust society.
Yeah.
And so there are things. And so why I say you can't be McTrad or go back to the 1950s, what you can do, at least, I think, is start to formulate a political formula and formulate a value system based around the things that we know worked for human society, and start trying to reintroduce them in a way and synthesize them with what we currently have. Like the internet, for example, has done an ungodly amount of damage to human society, whether it's porn, whether it's our relationships, whether it's our access to information or the government trying to control narratives. However, that information and that tool can also be used as a vast library of esoteric knowledge. I mean, thank God for people which they're trying to control. But I mean, like, thank God for people like Curtis Garvin, because now I'm aware of like Dujuvenel, De Maistre, Carlyle, people that aren't regularly taught. And so, to me, at least, when we talk about the question of governance, identifying what worked, I mean, it's the most basic aspect of human problem solving, right? Like identifying clearly what has worked. And people are just saying, well, that's, argumentum ad antiquitatem. And sure, maybe. But I mean, there's a reason why the phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is such a truism in my little Southern mind, because hell, I mean, we've clearly deviated from the last 4,000 years of what made society work and develop in relative peace and, well, not peace, but at least a relative, aspect of stability for development. And we have clearly gone off the deep end where there's suicide, drug use. We have systems of the economy and systems of government that routinely mock, plebs for getting addicted to opioids. We've got people that are, routinely bullied online to a point where they kill themselves. We mock those who have any semblance of faith or any human decency,
or even any desire that, even like any desire for a traditional, not even just a traditional arrangement, but even like, especially like if you're a man online, like your desire, like any sort of masculine display of sexuality is sort of immediately demonized. Like I remember, like there was this meme that went around about the laughing girls, like going to like Doomer incel Wojak. Oh my God, he like has a romantic fantasy about the girl that gave him the slightest bit of attention. And it's like, I tried to do a thread about that. And I'm going to write an article. I'm going to have my first Substack article I'm going to publish on it, where like basically these people with like OnlyFans and like the hammer and sickle in their bio, it's like they started attacking me. It's really crazy how any sort of sign of any sort of like desire for intimacy on a personal but also a community level is like immediately like equated with being like, I guess saying trad is just like saying incel nowadays.
Well, Gio, like, my concern
one last
is that
point. One last
Go
point.
ahead, Gio.
Like you mentioned about the newspapers, like what happened to all of them? They got bought up by corporations that got bought up by bigger media corporations. Like one of my old man's best friends, his family for many years ran in our town a local newspaper by hand, by the way, with a hand press.
Wow.
And like typeset.
Classy.
It's crazy. And for many years, my old man's one of his best friends, what happened was the local newspaper got bought up by the Standard, which is in my region the #1 newspaper, and the Standard got bought up by Torstar, which owns the Toronto Star, and the Toronto Star got bought up by an even bigger media corporation, if I recall correctly. So what happened was all of these like local news affiliates and newspapers basically got churned up by the forces of like immense like print, now digital techno capital, because like God forbid you actually have like local pamphlet dissident newspapers that used to be quite common back in the day, like before the internet became widely accessible to most people in even North America. You had like, I mean, a lot of them were like schizos or whatever, but like they had like pamphlets and like their own newspapers and everything. So
like a Francis E. Deck type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which was the topic of my stream with Jeffrey Schollenberger. But go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
But to push back on this, number one, actually three things. So thing number one to what you were just talking about, Gio, I wonder how many people in a couple of years from now are going to be even reading a lot of these tech conglomerate newspapers,
or even reading
the
it
tech.
all. To tell you the truth.
Well, hold on a second. Or even the tech conglomerate media that less people, I think, today are consuming, as opposed to consuming something like, the YouTubers that they're finding out there. Now, you could say that certain YouTubers have already aligned with the dark forces or whatever, but at the same time, there is still more independent content out there for people to grasp at, as opposed to concentrating on these dinosaurs, which are trying to fill themselves up by eating like these remnants of the local newspapers. But it's not going to be enough for them. Eventually, they're going to starve to death, I think, I hope. But the second point number two, prudentialist, I think that if you were to have a conversation with Barry Weiss, she'd probably agree with you. She'd probably agree with you on most of the problems that you're outlining. But why not? Because look, if there is something that she doesn't get here, if there is some miscommunication, misunderstanding, then either she's going to be able to convince you, or you're going to be able to convince her, or people who are around her. I generally think these problems, if there isn't anything that's kind of like not being seen behind the scenes, these are the exact people who you should be talking to, as opposed to the lowest common denominator, which is constantly going on Twitter.
It's funny you mentioned Barry Weiss, because I think that what we're talking about, she's a perfect example of like, well, when cancel culture comes for me, then I'll start complaining about it. But Barry Weiss is interesting because if you look at her interviews, like her like god awful book she had, where she equates her certain let's say tribal affiliation with the literal order of civilization itself. Like she claims that as civilization becomes more anti then inevitably like society crumbles, which historically is just not true. But it's a good point, because what we have now is a lot of because of globalization and various other forces, we have a lot of people who are essentially being allowed to weaponize their own particular forms of parochial ethno-narcissisms and to craft public policy around their particular instantiations of their own identity, whereas that capacity is denied to other people. And I know it's like a basic, like, alt-right 1.0 talking point, but it is kind of true how we've seen governance itself becoming subsumed into a lot of these like global conflicting ethno-particularities, and really the liberalism that even the founders envisioned, I don't really think they had like Barry Weiss versus Ocasio-Cortez versus Ilhan Omar bringing their international conflicts to the shores of America and then crafting policy around those conflicts.
Forget AOC, forget Ilhan Omar. Again, I'm not talking about the lowest.
Forget Barry Weiss. I mean,
not forget Barry Weiss. No, it's not the same, because we're not talking about the lowest common denominator here. We're actually talking about people who have done a lot more right now to help, as far as helping people who get inundated with problems from cancel culture. I'm sorry, but she's done a lot more than many people.
She's done
on Twitter.
Okay, but she has done, and so has Chris Rufo. But the question, right, at the end of the day, and this is where I sort of take issue with maybe the Barry Weisses and the James Lindsays of the world. And I know that I'm a nobody. I can totally recognize that. But I think that there's a valid criticism to make when you've got people like James Lindsay or Barry Weiss striking back against what they call cancel culture or the woke, but they want to preserve the ideological system that allowed wokeness to take over in the first place.
Exactly.
Because you've got a problem. And again, this is where this is where the reactionary in me will come out. This is where I've sort of had my eyes opened on the issue, is that it's like, what got us here? And the question, I think that there are some people that will tell you that it's the Reformation or Calvinism or Protestant. I'm not going to get into that one. What I will say is that we've clearly got a system of liberalism that has allowed for rampant atomization, rampant, hyper individualization, focus primarily only on line go up politics and the commodification of these sort of various ethno identities that ensure that we are going to remain divided upon, ethnic lines, which I mean, to some degree, we always will be, but we're divided on ethnic, monetary, all these sort of classist-based issues, which allows us to spend so much time squabbling over, say, identitarian problems, squabbling over class problems, and not looking at the real, almost the superstructure of it all, which is this ideological framework that has gotten us to where we are. So I think that it goes back to the question of good governance. You need to have a formula that deviates from this commodification, that deviates from this hyper individualization. So when we talk about, well, okay, government only focuses on line go up. And you'll get people like Moldbug saying like, okay, like say you do the neo-cameralist thing, we have like a joint stock company or whatever. What makes government profitable? And to me, I think the way that you start measuring profitability is not through, say, GDP. I'm not saying you go like the whole Kingdom of Bhutan thing and start measuring happiness, but I think that should be incorporated. I think that you should be incorporating the fertility rate of a nation. You should be monitoring like the birth rates. You should be monitoring median household income. And I think that the way that we generate that needs to be recalculated to focus more so on the lower and middle class. And of course, like in suicide rates, like if the suicide rate is jumping up, clearly something has gone wrong. And so for that, I think that you need to start moving away from a moral system that has, led us to where we are now.
But what I wanted to ask you before is, well, really quickly, people would say, you have Edmund Burke as your profile, and he's your boy. I know, like in the reactionary circles, a lot of people would say that, like Edmund Burke was like the conservative or whatever of his day.
A Whig for sure.
It was a failure, and so what would you say to that? Do you think like some form of like classic style conservatism?
Burke is like a weird 50-50 for me, because like Burke's biggest thing that people like rag on him for being sort of the quote unquote conservative is that Burke identified the issue of like, well, any system that can't incrementally change or get with the times is bad, or that it'll set itself up for failure. And that's where everyone shits on Burke. And to some degree, that's right, because any sort of apathy towards incrementalism inevitably results towards absolutism, and that's bad. However, what I do like about Burke is that Burke has this very interesting concept of rights. And Burke's idea of the social contract is that who are you, so-and-so, living in this time and age, dare modify the social contract when, it also affects everyone who's been dead and who's alive and who is yet to be born. There's this inherited concept of rights, and you have to fight to defend what you have, your birthright, what has been inherited to you. And to me, that's what's important, because clearly our society in the West has said, fuck that, and has thrown out any sort of willpower or sort of, animated will to power, so to speak, to borrow.
I remember when
to defend it.
I remember when Molly Meme was still a libertarian. I don't know what he's up to now after he got banished from the internet. He said, like, he had this argument about, well, I didn't vote for the social contract, therefore, it's like, that's the people, I think, they don't realize that, I think in the Burkean idea, that's the closest that, like, on the cusp of modernity, I believe, was like Burke's era. That's like the closest that we can sort of get to a like Greek civilization concept of nomos, or like before them, where they got, like some people say they got it from the Egyptians, their concept of mat, where it's like this law, this contract is something that is almost metaphysical in nature, that is going to guide a civilization into the future from the past. And it's something that is really eternal and animates every person within it. Kind of like, the Chinese Confucian like mandate of heaven. There's problems with that as well. But I get where Burke is coming from, whereas nowadays we look at law as something that is purely legalistic and juridical and lacks any sort of higher principle beyond like some friend-enemy distinction, right? So
no sense of honor. But there was a point that I wanted to push back on when it comes to the third point, which is prudentialist, geo. The problems you guys are talking about and the eventual outcome you would want to see, I really doubt, and again, you could push back on me all you want about this, I really doubt that if you sat down with Barry Weiss and James Lindsay in the room and I locked the door, so that nobody could get out.
With a revolver and one bullet.
If you guys sat
myself then.
If you guys sat down and just illustrated for them the problems that you see here, and just for them to give it their best shot at countering it, and to see this is why you're wrong, yada yada yada, just so that everybody's on the same page about this stuff. I really don't think that if you are correct about a lot of these problems, they would see things that differently. The caveat I would add, though, the reason why, again, talking about like the whole, even the word reactionary, is that we talked about the problems, we talked about the outcome that we would want to see in the future. What we did not talk about is how do you implement that, at which point one other thing that's been avoided this entire conversation that goes hand in hand in the minds of most people when they hear the word reactionary is absolute dictator, somebody to come in, clean house. This is not something that I have any doubt is in the minds of a lot of people who are listening to this right now, that there are people out there who only see that as being the one solution, and they look at other countries, Russia, as an example of how it should be done without knowing a damn thing about these countries other than what's been projected to them through the internet. That is my biggest concern, and I honestly think that is the biggest concern of people like Barry Weiss. Because if we're talking about, let's say, anti-Semitism...
Well, I don't know. I mean,
Well, hold on, Gio, you got to let me finish here. So
you got to stop mentioning Barry Weiss, Lev. It's not going to end well.
If we're talking about it's going to end great. It's going to end great. You know why? Because when you're uncomfortable, that means you're actually growing. So anyway, when it comes to all these things having to do with like talking about how, okay, fine, Spain was not eliminated because of the anti-Semitic policies that it started to create. Like there's still a Spain that exists right now. But what I would say is that in more of the metaphysical sense, I believe that policies that end up excluding people based on characteristics that they have no power over, as opposed to excluding people based on what they bring or don't bring to the table, as far as discriminating on racial characteristics versus discriminating on culture, discriminating on what exactly people have to offer to a civilization. When you make that distinction, this is when I think a lot of the people who are around your base start degenerating into the state of an animal. And I believe that the state of degenerating into an animal can both be seen in primitive societies and can also be seen in, let's say, more advanced bugman societies. I see that level of only thinking about statistics and where the arrow goes. I see that as also being a primitive state of being divorced from wisdom. But likewise, I see the state of discriminating people.
But the counter argument is that the people that do like ostensibly have political power over us, they are thinking in that way. And so for us to say, well, we have to rise above it and not think in these, well, I don't know, Prudentialist, please help me out here.
Okay, like I don't. Lev is hitting the point that everyone sort of gets when it comes to sort of criticizing anyone from like a reactionary perspective is like, oh, they're either like these weird neo-fasci types, or they want
an ethno state.
They want, well, which I don't, or they want a monarchy, or they want some kind of supreme ruler, God on earth kind of deal. And I still don't know what I want, which is the fun part of doing all this stuff, because I'm still trying to figure out what sort of the best way to move forward is. But that's the pushback, right? But go ahead, Gio. You quantify your position.
No, I was going to say really quickly, I don't want to cut you off, but what I mean is that I think that if we had a civilization that could handle a sort of absolute ruler that is embodying the sort of metaphysical principles of that particular civilization, whether you could do it through patchwork or not is debatable. But I think, like, to me, monarchism or neo-monarchism is sort of like an ideal that is motivating people that, or should. It's not like I don't believe in some like LARP fantasy. Even like I think the mold bug system has just fundamental flaws that would make that form of absolutism not work. Hence, I came up. I stole a term from Mark Fisher. The term acid monarchism, the sort of psychic force that can motivate people into a sort of a habituation towards something that could. Sorry, I'm just I'm just
Well,
wigging
I
out
want
right
to
now.
throw. I
Please,
want to throw.
no, Prudentialist, continue your point.
Well,
Sorry.
before Prudentialist goes on, I just want to quickly add one more caveat into this, which I think is extremely important. When you do this process of exclusion, thinking that it's going to keep a certain amount of order, again, keeping in mind we're not living in the Middle Ages anymore, we're living in a different society. What you end up creating, and we've seen this time and time again, we're still seeing the ramifications of this right now, I think, is you are creating an internal enemy class. That happened in Russia during imperialist Russia, where there was a stratified class system where, let's say, you can work as a what was it, like a fixer, like builder, construction worker. You're basically working as a worker. And there was this one guy, I don't remember his name right now, but he was working as a worker. He got paid well, no problem with that. He had a good house, but there was one problem. He nor his father, nor his grandfather, nor his kids in the system that existed back then would ever be able to become a engineer. Becoming an engineer, even though he was totally qualified for that position based on his expertise, was completely inaccessible to him. And I believe that example has been shown time and time again throughout imperialist Russia as something that ended up fomenting an internal enemy class that ended up creating chaos afterwards. So my whole thing is, why are you kicking yourself in the butt by producing these internal enemy classes within your country if there is a better way to go about fixing a lot of these problems?
Okay, so to me, the issue of social mobility, right? Because I think that's what you're identifying here, Lev, is the issue of social mobility and the inability, the stratification of the economy. We're already there, I would argue. I mean, if you want to take a look at, say, wealth disparity and economic mobility between, say, millennials and Gen X is just night and day. The average amount of wealth accumulated by people from my graduating class of college, which was 2018. They're in the red. Negative. I think the average was something along the lines of like $28,000, right? Like they have our ability to buy equity, to buy property. We're already there. So the issue with mobility is something that you're absolutely right, that if people want to aspire to be something, that system should be in place for them to learn said trade and go on. I want the concept of the nation state to survive, because obviously what has been proven throughout history is that the nation state has provided the best form of, geopolitical and internal stability for a nation. Whether that is governed by a monarchy or a republic, I think honestly some form of indirect democratic monarchism would probably be the way to go, because clearly what we have seen is that the popular sovereignty in our society, especially now with the internet, can easily be fomented in a way where, just read Noam Chomsky's, Manufacturing Consent, or Walter Lippmann's The Public Opinion. Obviously, popular sovereignty can be whatever a certain political elite want it to be, and that's concerning. We would need to identify ways in which the masses are not put into a position where someone is declared the enemy, like what we see nowadays, like where white people are declared the enemy by the media and the establishment. That would need to be addressed. But my greatest concern is that whatever comes forward from here, we need to formulate, and that again, it comes back to the question of good governance. You need to formulate a political formula that tells people there's a better alternative, that there is a value system worth adhering to that's more than just, oh, I bought my Funko Pops, I took my selfie, I made my soy face, I'm eating my Beyond Meat bug burger, and that there's a better world out there. And I think that there's a natural...
How many people are like that, though? I'm really curious. How many people are actually...
In terms of what? In terms of...
Okay, I want to push back again on this notion, just because I see it so much on Twitter. I really think that these are like the brain dregs of society, that when people who are on more of a reactionary end look at them, they end up creating more of a romantic play inside of their heads of a dystopia where these bugmen are in charge. And maybe you're right. Maybe partly it is that. But at the same time, my concern is that you don't make room for more nuance when it comes to people within that power structure, where things may be changing and we're not really seeing it that much. There have been certain films that have been coming out recently that have been starting to push against this wokeness in the air, don't do it.
Three things.
Yeah.
So three things to respond. One, even though we make the Bugman as sort of the stereotypical thing, think about how many people are just the average consumer that will occasionally that'll watch the Cape shit Marvel movies, or not really care where they eat, or not really care about how things are, and they're very much apathetic to the system, and they just try their best to live their lives. To me, I think that that's more of the majority than sort of the stereotypical Bugman thing. And to me, I'm concerned about that, because it's just like, I think that there's a better world out there, and I think that we just need to introduce it to them. I'm not trying to discount nuance or say that things are so black and white, because they never are. The second thing that I would push back on is that, okay, even though the power structure and the powers that be, like, I'm reminded of our conversation with Mark Terrell. I mean, that guy wanted to make phone calls. He was very Machiavellian in the instance that he's just like, well, if you knew about the Matt Gaetz thing, then obviously you would have a lot of power, and you would have a lot of aspect to do exactly what you want to do to get this guy to do what you want. It's blackmail. I'm thinking to myself, true, but it's incredibly concerning that a guy with no real aspect of a morality system, or a guy that's sort of just looking out for himself and not maybe a grander image of community or the nation or the world or whatever, is the guy in charge. And so when we talk about, this sort of Bugman or this midwit or whatever, there's a lot of people like Mark out there in the world, whether that's in the DMV, your county clerk's office, or even, a part of the federal government, that have a lot of say in how things get done. And to me, that's a bit concerning.
Is exactly... Oh, go on.
And then the third point I would bring up is that even though there's a lot of baggage that comes with, say, the word reactionary, and I can admit that there certainly is, and maybe a different term needs to be come up with. That famous phrase, if you don't like what they're saying, change the subject of the conversation, and maybe a different name needs to be come up with it, and probably so for political reasons. But what I would say, at least for those who hold this sort of reactionary perspective, is that there's an identification at the very least of saying, hey, some things have clearly gone wrong. What can we do to either improve the system or take what worked from the past and try to synthesize it for the future, which is why I think you get the phrase neo-reaction from a lot of people. But to me, at the very least, when it comes to that subject of governance, the way that we need to identify, and it goes back to your conversation, Lev, about sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is that clearly the woke bullshit, that dogma where woke capital kind of like virtue signals and will take an initial financial loss and say like ratings or money, whatever, if it just means that they can create another generation of consumers that will purchase said product upon virtue signaling, sort of like in a Pavlovian sense, which is really disturbing. I think that if you were to somehow interrupt the transmission of said mind virus and just sort of get people in a room, like you were saying, and just be like, shit's kind of fucked. So what do we do about it? And I think that's when you could probably get a lot of common ground and a lot of conversation.
Well, this is exactly what Break the Rules is doing. I mean, for those who don't know,
and I'm all for it.
Yeah. Like breaktherules.tv. I'm going to post the link in there. That's just like for the people who are just listening to it. That's where you go to. And what we have been doing, as Gio said in the very beginning of the show, is we've been bringing people together who are, let's say, from your sphere prudentialist, as well as people who, and I'm not even going to say from Mark's sphere, because Mark's sphere is a very specific sphere. I'm talking more about bringing in people who, again, I know, Gio, you don't want me to say the B word, Barry Weiss, but bringing in people who are more within that sphere, because it is kind of like the metaphorical locking of the room.
Well,
like
James Lindsay refuses to debate me on postmodernism.
Well, there's more people, there's more fish in the sea. That's all I'm going to say about that. But suffice it to say, we have people out there who, if they were to listen to the things that Prudential has brought up right now, I would be incredibly curious how they'd be able to downplay them. If this is something where I do think that there are people out there who are not just grifters, but people who generally care about the well-being of communities, and if there were certain things that they would not have considered before, then I think by all means they would be able to consider them. And I'm not saying it's going to be Barry Weiss. It may not be Barry Weiss. It may be somebody else. But my whole thing here, people were saying before in the comment, like, I argue, like, I don't want to screw up your algorithm, or if it even matters here. But, I argue like one of the people of the tribe. And I am, for those who do not know, one of the people of the tribe. So, whoa, big surprise there. Sorry, I didn't mean to say the F word. But
You're good, man. You're fine.
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
Okay, I hate when people who are Jewish try to hide that from people and try to pretend to be something that they're not. I never hide that. Number one, I never hide my support of Israel. And what I would also say when it comes to, yes, I'm going all out. I don't care anymore.
The view of Lev Polyakov is not the views of breaking rules. It's always to himself.
When it comes to a lot of these things, I generally believe that the community and the family importance that we see in Israel, that we see in Jewish communities here in New York, for instance, it is something that I can only wish would be much more prevalent among people everywhere in the United States, because family is strength. I generally believe that family is strength, and this is something that for all those who think like, oh my God, how could he, why isn't he saying that we should import more migrants in here? It's like, no, because the people who are saying that are absolutely ass blasted by decades of Soviet propaganda that have infiltrated into the United States. And you could say that there are other reasons for those pieces of propaganda to exist. Those people, whether they're Jewish or European or whatever, I don't care about those people, and they don't care about me. They would never have me in their club, nor would I want to be in their club.
Well, Lev, I'm glad that you've said that people in America definitely do deserve their own theocratic ethno-states like Israel. I really think that is kind of the model. But yeah. I think the problem is that we have to sort of confront the reality that there are generally people that, and you could say that they're just like nobody academics or whatever, that every blue tick follows each other, but there are people that do genuinely hate people like us and want us destroyed. I mean, I remember a screen capped. This was when I forget who said it. I think it was either James Lindsay or someone else about or it was a Tucker Carlson about fertility rates. I remember I screen capped this one person who's an academic saying all this discourse is just white supremacy anyways. And so it's we have to ignore it. And it's that type of attitude, I think you're never really truly going to get past it. And of course, I don't advocate any sort of violent LARP fantasy that a lot of people with sort of neuroatypicalism.
By the way, it is interesting. Reptile's comment over here about whether the Jewish ethno-state legitimate, stuff like that. What I would answer there is, if you take a look at the Senate in Israel and who takes part in it, it's not just the Jews. And it's not just the Arabs. It's also the Druze. It's also the Bedouins. There are various people there that get represented, and that is also what I'm from.
Yeah,
what I'm for. As long as
we know who.
No. Why do you think that? Because
look,
again,
we're not going to talk about Israel. Stop.
We can save that for a whole other stream.
Save it for a whole the apocalypse
when all our channels will get destroyed.
Yeah, when we're all off YouTube, then we can talk about it.
But what I was going to say is that there still is a reality that people do genuinely hate us, and I don't see any apart from complete balkanization, some kind of Sarajevo type of thing. I really don't see past legit people with tenure saying that it's a good thing that white people have less kids, and meanwhile the black abortion rate in America, I mean, that's why their population has hovered around only 13%, which I think is totally monstrous, whatever you think of the race politics of it. But that being said, that's so pretentious. What do you think of that? I don't really see any solution of I only maybe it's I'm being blackpilled, but I tend to just see a further acceleration of the discourse that we have now. It's already at a hysterical level on all sides. So I don't know.
And so okay, my question about good governance and my question about, or my issue with everything that we've talked about so far, right? Especially when we talk about balkanization, I get that talked about all the time.
Yeah.
And Lev could probably relate to this, right? The dissolution of the Soviet Union. You had widespread global intervention. You had widespread, military and economic interests invade, the iridescent territory, the Russia itself, about nuclear weapons. The entire world of those people was turned upside down. And arguably, you could say probably to some extent for the worse. And the reason why I say I don't want balkanization and I don't want acceleration of the United States is because you are then going to see the collapse of sort of the world order We're talking about international trade. We're talking about international relations. We're talking about how our way of life and our comfortable aspect of food and medical supply lines would evaporate overnight. You balkanize, you're going to have the world get intervening, trying to invade parts of the United States to make sure the nuclear weapons don't get into the wrong hands. And with good reason, because if any sort of nuclear weapon were to go off, arguably that's probably the end of the world. And that to me is just really concerning. I can't advocate for balkanization. I can't advocate for accelerationism. I will never ask to immanentize the eschaton. However, what I can say is that some sort of narrative, and this is where Moldbug talks about sort of like the two-story state, that you need some kind of narrative that can bring people together. And unfortunately, you've been seeing a clash between the classic white American revolutionary conversation about, these settlers conquered a frontier, they created a government, they were the WASP sort of deal, and I hate that term. I really do. It bothers me because Zoomers just use it to shit on white people, and I don't like it. But
I'm not white, thank God.
Oh yeah, you're Italian. You based med. But and so the problem though, right, is that. Okay, you have the classic Anglo-American traditional narrative of what the United States is, and then we have sort of this Christopher Caldwell, post-1965, post-civil rights era narrative where like white supremacy or slavery is the original sin. We've got to eradicate them. We've got to get rid of all this, and that's the problem. And that's the issue I've got there. Is that, okay, these are two obviously irreconcilable narratives. Where one is considered racist, white, and evil, and white is now almost the equal word to evil by many people on the left, at least in these academic narrative creators. So how do you reconcile that? And that's the problem, right? You get the normie Tim Scott GOP thing where it's like, well, we're better now. We can combine the two and synthesize these narratives. Obviously, that hasn't worked because we're at where we are now in terms of our political divide. So I think that becomes the only way that we're going to achieve some sort of good governance is that if we do, I think, to an extent what Lev is saying, and start talking to those that want to preserve this crappy system and start providing an alternative political formula to get them out. Because if there's any sort of validity to all these Italian elite theory schools, is that the normies like myself and people who do their day jobs and do this on the side probably aren't going to change the world. I'm probably not going to be in the history books, and that's fine.
Well, you could be the butterfly that flaps its wings and causes
and to an extent, that's what I would like. And what I'm saying is that, okay, great. But if an alternative can be created to where either my activism or the activism of others can tell sort of disaffected elites or a new generation of elites to hedge their bets against the current system, then I'm all for it. And that's why I'm saying this is going to take time. I don't expect it to happen in my lifetime.
But that's the difficulty, I think, of just being in America or being in North America, is that you're never going to contend with hopefully you would, but you always have to contend with the fact that North America is largely like a multi-ethnic, multi-racial society, whereas the problems that are plaguing Europeans in their countries, I think that's way more simple. I mean, for example, when it comes to France and Italy and the UK is kind of different because their experience is also somewhat multicultural, at least in the last 60 years. But those solutions are easy. Just kick them out. I don't know what's so hard about it. Just, you know what I mean? Reaffirm your identity, obviously. I mean, that's goes without saying. But when it comes to North America and to an extent Britain, Australia is not. Let's say the Anglosphere countries that have embraced this sort of hectic form of rapid multiculturalism that came out of those post-colonial periods, I think it's always going to be a difficulty. And so you really would either have complete balkanization, which you've said the problem. It is a nice romantic LARP fantasy, you all the black people move to Georgia or wherever, they have their Wakanda, and all the white people move to Montana and they have their what's the condiment? They're mayo, Swiss onion burger, ethno state. But I think you've brought up the obvious problems with that. So you're going to have to create sort of a monomyth that can at least somewhat stabilize political discourse, which I think is like you've said, I don't know. There's going to have to be a counter ruling class, I think, that is, and that in itself is sort of like a fantasy to have, like, oh well, we're gonna have based elites that, you know, Peter Thiel is gonna give us all money, and well, I mean, I hope Peter Thiel gives me money and puts me in some New York galleries, but I think like these things are going to take such a long time that I really don't know. It's every time we get to the question of solutions, I mean, it's kind of out of our hands, I hate to say it, but you know.
Well, and that's the reason why I think when we talk about governance, we talk about culture, is that, yeah, to a significant degree, I don't think that it's going to be in the hands of you, Gio, or in the hands of Lev, or the hands of myself, or even in the hands of people like James Lindsay and Barry Weiss. Although, as much as we brought up Barry and James, I think that it's important to note that I think James and Barry, and they've been very publicly about it, that they would die preserving liberalism than taking their ideas, which are just 10-year-old mold bug takes, and taking them to their logical conclusion. And so what to me is the issue from here on out, right, is that we can spend all day trying to come up with new forms of government and new forms of anything, but until I think you change the value system, or what we identify are the values of the people, not much is going to be accomplished. Because there are too many people, I think, at least in the here and now, that are okay to just go with the flow as long as, you know, they can get access to their food, they can watch their Netflix, and things are fine.
But like you said, it's the little, it's sort of like the common and mundane things that are more like detrimental to the average person. Like this even came up like in that Alex Kashoot interview with Jeffrey Miller, where Jeffrey, he had a good point where he said, you know, like all these like McTrads, they talk about like, you know, polycules and some like weird pod city sexual communist arrangement where, like, you know, these like hyper rationalist people, they justify their own like quote unquote consent based group commitment or with honesty. Like, you know, I mean, we had Ayala on, and she's like one of these people. It's actually quite scary. But those people, they're on the fringes. They're on like the margins. They're always going to be like freakish, weird, like hipster subculture. But the people that do like have casual hookups, that's probably even more, you know what I mean? That's probably even more detrimental to people. The culture around like no fault divorce and casual hookups, that I think is even more soul crushing than like, you know, so the average weirdo that has a polycule or whatever, right? So, but
now,
trads, us trads, we do make a lot of this stuff. I don't know, it's true.
Now, I wanted to go back to what Prudentialist talked about before regarding Russia. When you were talking about the exporting of, let's say, nuclear arms, I think this is what you were talking about in the previous episode we did on BTR. I do want to say that when it came to that exporting, it was not the matter of, oh, all of a sudden, like Russia got disillusioned and, you know, there was no more Soviet Union. And now, like, all these engine parts and nuclear arms and bombs were all sold to the highest bidder in the third world. That is, even though that was happening then, and I'll tell you who was facilitating that shortly, it was also happening during the USSR. It was happening all the time, like whether we're talking about Cuba or we're talking about like all these other nations out there. The Soviet Union was hemorrhaging arms that got into the hands of all these different third world countries way before it collapsed. But also, if we are talking about who was facilitating a lot of these, a lot of this selling of these arms to the third world countries post collapse, it was Putin.
Well, what I was saying more so was just that my comparison for the dissolution of the Soviet Union to sort of this talk about the balkanization of the U.S. is that I'm just concerned about the invitation of other powers and being ruled over by the devil I don't know versus the devil I do know. So when people sort of talk about like, oh, the globalist American empire or, you know, things like that, I get concerned when people advocate for its collapse, because it's just like, guys, like the entire way of life that you have grown up living in is because of this international system and is because of the American like hard and soft power that exists. You don't, to me, any sort of solution needs to take out the governing ideology and not necessarily the institutions. And I know that that's an incredibly tall order, but like,
oh god, yeah.
but like, think about it. Like, we're talking about international trade, international waters. We're talking about, the way in which the economy more or less functions, the global reserve currency, the petrodollar, all of that. I mean, that disappears overnight. Or say you get your revolution, your based idea, get rid of it now, like bam, like you're inviting powers that have no regard for your well-being to start taking over, and would probably put their people first well before you. And
Like
to
the
me,
Chinese,
that's my concern.
But would that power also in this scope include the power that's ruling over you in the form of, like in Russia, right after the Soviet Union fell, it was all the ex-KGB people. They were the ones who were making the deal with Yeltsin. For example, there was this article from the BureauInvestigates.com talking about how in 1992, Putin was investigated for a deal he oversaw while an official in the mayor's office. So this was in St. Petersburg. And the deal involved the export of $100 million worth of raw materials in exchange for food for citizens of St. Petersburg. The materials were exported, but the food never arrived. So it's stuff like this which leads me to the conclusion, at least if we're talking about Russia, that while you could have some bad actors that would try to, create a worse situation for Russia, you don't need to look as far as the actual leadership that it had at the time to look for the people that were extracting as much out of it as possible.
I mean, and I don't know. Like Melphis says here, he says, "My country lived as a Soviet tributary for more or less, and when things got worse once the U.S. was involved here." And I mean, I know that there's objections here, but what I'm saying is that okay, great, Soviet Union collapsed, U.S. support and things like that. You have a foreign power starting to get involved in those affairs. It helped prop up things like having KGB run things. The oligarchs, all these systems here. I'm saying that things would probably get worse if that were to happen here in the United States. I have some issues. But
no, I agree with that too. This was just an aside.
Oh no, that's fine. It's just to me, like when we talk about governance, like I'm just a bit skeptical, and again, because it's the devil I don't know versus the devil I do. I would like for the current governing ideology that rules over my government and that rules over sort of the financial institutions and whatnot, which to be destroyed. And that's why I'm thinking any political formula has to provide a better value system and a better alternative. This is why you get a lot of reactionaries like Geo or even Aaron McIntyre that will tell you make art, make movies, make poetry, make fiction. Don't just do political hot takes on Twitter or make videos about what people are talking about eating the bugs, even though I just did a video on that. It's important to, I think, create something that provides some aspect of, aesthetic qualities and beauty. Yeah. Because if there's not a cultural counter value to all of this atomizing, hyper individualistic, hyper capital, line go up, just import more people, the whole Matthew Iglesias 1 billion Americans
thing. 6 million. 6 million more.
Yeah, author of 1 billion Americans, or all that needs to go.
1 trillion more Americans.
I want to make a quick declaration with my transparent drinking vessel to everybody listening. Please DM and follow me on Twitter at LevPo if you want to send me anything related to some of the things that were talked about in the chat. I don't want the chat to be hijacked for this, which is why I say, like, if you want to send me certain things, LevPo on Twitter, just please send me a DM or go to our Discord as well, the link, which look, this is a shilling opportunity. This is great. So, or go and join our Discord, and we can continue those kind of conversations there or in the DM. Because I generally, like, my whole thing, Prudentials, like I said before, I generally think that if the people that we invite on, that I would love to invite with you in the conversation, if they are going to just keep a very close lock on whatever their beliefs are, that's no good. There has to be an opportunity in these back and forths to be able to play devil's advocate and to be able to let everything that a person has a problem with as far as your worldview goes be vocalized and in the open. I really see that as being the only way forward here.
Your thoughts, Gio?
I don't know what to say. Yeah, I mean, let's not talk about the Israel thing again, please.
No, I'm not talking about that in general. I'm just talking about, in general, any contentious conversation at all when it comes to how do we discuss it. So many people,
I think,
you know.
the problem that I see with that, and I know it's kind of like cutting into the margins of what we do, but I think, like, honestly, there's only so much you can do if there is a willingness there to engage with other people. There's only, like, I think, like, the sort of romantic fantasy of, like, the, what would you say, like the early YouTube, like, Gamergate people, the alt-light, whatever you want to call them, grifters, where they're talking about, like, we just have to talk to these people sort of deal. I think, yeah, it's true, you have to talk to people, but at the same time, I mean, there's just no getting past nowadays certain loyalties and affiliations and certain, like, you know, products of one's own Welch along that are make, like, discourse with someone that you think is like a neo-Nazi or whatever impossible. So I don't know, it's as much as I think, like, we would want a recapitulation of what America was supposedly built upon, which is, like, free and open discourse among its citizenry. Sorry, I just, in the current political climate, I just don't see this happening, because the cost of actually engaging with very controversial ideas is so great and the benefits so little, that in order to, like, re-engineer society in a way where the cost of having our ideas is very little, but the benefits are very numerous, that is, I think, the sort of systems theory approach that is often talked about, but almost near impossible to sort of envision outside of some kind of, like, cultural shift or reconquista. Because the way things are now, the cost of even engaging with people that are quote unquote controversial is so great to, like, people that, especially within certain sectors of the corporatocracy. I mean, being a wagey for some tech company, the cost of, like, going on a quote unquote racist podcast is so heavy that, like, I mean, we've seen it with our own eyes on BTR, where, like, you know, certain people will say something controversial and then other people will, like, welch out, and, like, you see their eyes open up. And it's like, it's not a good.
You know what? No, Gio, I disagree with you, because even though that system may be in place right now, I see kind of like, you know, how you have a certain chart for, let's say, a certain actress you may like and want to get together with, and she gets older and older, and the accessibility for you to being able to get her starts to get higher and higher. At a certain point, you end up meeting. So why I'm illustrating this,
we get a lot of scrubs who've been canceled.
No. That's not what I'm saying. It's not that. What it is we get people who are getting more and more fed up with the system as it is. So at a certain point, just like I was talking about regarding imperialist Russia, that people were fed up by not being able to, you know, even if they merit-wise would be able to become an engineer, because of who they were born from, they were not able to become an engineer. And that sense of, you know, just that shaking in your soul of something not being right, at a certain point, not for everybody, but for a certain amount of people, it's going to reach a certain level that's going to cross with appearing and talking with people on Break the Rules. I think this is already happening. It's just start.
But not even just politically, like, even just, okay, separate, like, the shitlord politics aside, even just, like, in terms of, like, the material conditions and the way in which the economy is being reconfigured, a lot of people, like a lot of us millennials and Zoomers or whoever, we're not going to have the same view of having a quote unquote career the way that our parents instantiated in our minds as, like, you have to go to university, you have to get a career. Yeah. Because, like, for example, academia, I think, is one thing where, as you know, there become corporate finishing schools, you'll have, like, whole, and it's already happening, you'll have, like, whole departments being slashed. And so therefore it's not just that someone like me who has a, you know, graduate degrees, who can't, like, meaningfully go into a PhD program and get a job. It'll be like that, you know, not just because of political reasons, but just in general, the conditions by which an economy can sustain, like, you know, graduates who don't have jobs. it's going to like eventually fall, like maybe not fall apart, but slowly like wither away. Same with like corporations like importing like high skilled laborers, like it's, you know, in Silicon Valley, for instance.
Well, we also, I think, did not talk about the impact, for better or worse, that robotics and automation is going to have. Here's an example. We recently got a one of those robots that goes around and cleans the house. You know, like what was that robot called? You know, the one that the cat likes riding. Roomba. Thank you. So this is just the beginning, fellas. If we're talking about a robot, imagine a robot that's going to go up the stairs, that's going to be able to wipe around every, like, it's going to be made up of some bendable plastic that can like go around corners and whatever. So imagine that robot for a second, and then imagine all the people who are coming here from other places in the world, completely being out of a job, completely being without any reason to actually be in the United States, because there's no need for them anymore if you have a robot that does this kind of stuff. And that's going to be a whole other paradigm that I don't even think people are thinking about that much right now, and what exactly that's going to bring about.
Well, I think this is where you'll, not to bash on, say, McTrad types, but I mean, I think that there's some value in even transcendental, but there's that emotional value that comes with hard work. I talked about this in a recent video, one of my Real Talk videos, which is me fishing. And I just sort of ranted about what's on my mind. It's honest to God, one of the most peaceful things you can do. But I was talking about sort of like finding your own Walden Pond, to quote from Henry David Thoreau. There's value in manual labor. There's value in things that we've definitely lost to. And I mean, we talk about things like hand strength being lost and all that sort of jazz. Like, that's totally concerning, that like the idea of manual labor and things like that are totally gone. And it's like, yeah, so when you talk, and it's funny, when we talked about that earlier, it's like, well, if you were to put someone back 500, 100 years ago, they would be totally screwed. And you're probably right, because the average person today doesn't know jack shit about farming. The average person today doesn't know jack shit about like cobblers or shoe repair or laying down a road. Yeah, most of these people will be totally screwed. But I mean, there's a value system there that I think is what we can definitely benefit from.
Well, there's a cultural thing. Like, back to Napoleon for a second. Napoleon, even though he was minor nobility, the school that he went to was absolutely Spartan, where he had to sleep on a stone bed. And there are certain things that people self-impose upon themselves. It's even interesting. Like, if we look back at the like 60s, 70s, 80s, although towards the 80s it's kind of changing, but like in the 60s and 70s, you look around a lot of young people, and even though there is like that chart that you would look at as far as like the devolution of the man, where you would have like the burly 1940s man, and then he would get like more feminized and sissified as the years progress, until he just like looked like this wafy figure. So the counter argument to that is, gyms are very popular right now. People are finding a lot of fitness advice online. People have the ability more than ever to be able to get in shape if they desire so. And I am seeing people who do have a lot more musculature than would have even been considered to be that popular or that in vogue in the 60s and 70s. Like, think of all those skinny rock stars, they're just like skeletons on stage. So I think
that was because of heroin, Lev. That's
sure. Okay. But basically what I'm getting to here is that I do see that there being streaks of sunshine as far as what people are able to do on a personal level to better themselves and to better the community around them. And it's going to be a challenge. Like, people say like, oh, you expect the Henrik says, hey guys, let the marketplace of ideas do its thing. That will certainly solve our problems. No, it's not going to solve our problems. This is a battle. It's always going to be a battle. And it's going to be, while we're incarnated in this form, it's always going to be a challenge and a battle. When it gets less of a battle is when you're only surrounded by people that agree with whatever it is you're saying, and it feeds into this perpetual cycle of not being anti-fragile, I think. And that goes for both people on the left and the right, or any wing or any bubble they happen to be inside. Because if you're not challenging yourself, if you're not absorbing ideas that would be able to actually strengthen your own argument, if it doesn't deflate itself over the time of acquiring further wisdom, then I think you're doing a big disservice to yourself.
Yeah, but then the time for arguments are over, I think. I don't know.
No, because you guys have only been exposed to bottom of the barrel people because they're fun
okay, my counter to that would be like, okay, social media, like Twitter, for example, if you're not banned on it, right, I can follow just about anybody I want, whether that's communists or whether that's James Lindsay or whoever. And the thing that I've noticed, and I did a video on this called Modern Day Girondon, which I know I just butchered the French pronunciation of the word, but like, you have people like Barry and James that are very much trying to keep the Overton window to a very specific brand of, say, classical liberalism. And if there's anything that I think that we can come to when we talk about all these observations about culture or about government or about, just how things function, even in an international sense, you've got the problem that is that, okay, clearly, how did we get here? And the problem is that liberalism spurred these issues, the hyper-individualization, what we would call woke capital, what we would call all of these problems that we've identified, and yet you want to preserve the system that got us to where we are now? Like, that's the definition of insanity.
Yeah,
but liberalism in that same respect also gave us, you could say, if we take liberalism as the engine of progress in countries like imperialist Russia, even though you could say it was very far from being liberal, of course. But my point here is that when certain liberal reforms started to be enacted upon that country, all of a sudden turned into a totalitarian state. So this idea that liberalism, which I consider myself to be a classic liberal, I know whatever, the liberalism is something that would automatically result in the situation we're in right now. Why can't you just as easily say, based on the past examples, that liberalism would also lead to totalitarianism, or liberalism would also lead to communism, or liberalism would also lead to anything, because it's led to a lot of different things. This is the paradigm we happen to be in right now. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to, preserve the aspects we want to preserve and create the kind of society where the problems you're addressing, prudentialists, would be able to be addressed. I consider it to be an absolute fight. The only thing that I know of is that if that fight is not being fought, I really think that the only thing that people have left, which we always have left, is to be a bunch of animals and to enact violence. And I generally don't see that as being a winning strategy as far as the reason why we've reincarnated into the forms that we currently occupy today.
No, but Lev, the thing is that we don't see violence as a solution, because in some ways the mechanisms of power have become so sophisticated under, like, whatever you want to call it, biopower, the societies of control, that the use of violence is not advantageous.
Great.
Right
so
now,
then
right
now,
now. No, to the ruling class. I mean, when it comes to violence in general, I mean, you're dealing with the forces of human history here, and liberalism is, however, 100 year, 200 years old. I mean, liberalism proper. I think like there's always going to be a sort of not a return fully, but sort of like a harmonious recurrence, if you will, of sort of these forces of human nature and history. But that being said, I mean, the problem is that it just goes to, like, for example, the ridiculousness of the statement that, like, all these bread tubers, these commie LARPers, they're like, fascism is just liberalism in decay. It's like, that's just total nonsense. If anything, like, well, I don't know, that's a tangent, but it is true. I mean, there is sort of a story there where liberalism may not be as totalizing as people like to think, but the form of like modern neoliberalism now, I do feel, is a sort of totalizing discourse that is sort of swallowing the world whole, and there really is no easy way to work around it, because the assumptions that liberalism and then now neoliberalism place upon itself is that this is just the natural course of history, and it's sort of like this Enlightenment reason thing where we're always going to end up here regardless, and like history's a straight line. That's a very hard brain worm to not convince the average person out of.
No, I don't see that.
What do you think of that? I don't know.
So, to me, even if you want to engage in these conversations, the existing regime has the institutions of social control, manufacturing consent, and of course the state security apparatus to clamp down on those who publicly virtue signal or counter signal, excuse me. So it does make it difficult to be a dissident, and it does make it very difficult to put things in a place of what we want the system to look like, or what government would look like in this current state of affairs. And so you'll get a lot of people that will take the perspective, at least from the reactionary side, that will say, okay, these time for these conversations has clearly failed. And I'm not an advocate for violence, because I have my self-interest of wanting to live to be in mind, but I think that there's going to have to be the issue of weathering the storm and trying to come out of it the best that you can. And so that means, where you'll have people trying to talk about, bettering themselves, having their own, libraries of knowledge, having their own sort of academic institutions. I'm so glad that the academic agent has the academic agency. All of these things, the average person, the average normie who goes out and watches Marvel movies, buys Funko Pops, and listens to their true crime podcast doesn't really care about these things. So really, at this point in time, for those who are interested, and those who have taken, say, a red pill or a black pill or whatever kind of pill, right? It doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, you have to take care of yourself and those immediately in front of you. So you'll get a lot of people that'll tell you about prepare for a lot of crappy things to come, but focus on yourself, your family, and your community, and work locally. Because I'm not going to change the world tomorrow. I'm not going to have my ideas be heard by some based Peter Thiel pissed off billionaire, and things are going to start changing. And if they do, fantastic. But if they don't, okay, no problem. What I can start doing is at least, survive the incoming storm and survive the and put out the wildfire that's in front of my house in my backyard before I start working about my neighbor's yard or something like that.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, and so you like the phrase think globally, act locally. I think that has a lot of important stuff here. And as Shrouded Hill says in the chat, current objective, survive, and that's exactly where we're at.
But I would counter to what you said earlier on when you said and I know that you don't believe the conversation is over, but to that general idea that people have, I don't think the conversation's even begun, because it would be like saying I was talking to this dog and this dog was barking at me, so we can't reach a conclusion.
Well, I mean, but it's a dog. It's not, you're not going to have a conversation with the dog. Now, if you were saying I'm having a conversation with a Frenchman and he's speaking to me in French and I'm speaking in English, then yeah, you could say the conversation has begun.
I would say the intellectual equivalent, at least when I've seen like left versus right type of things. A lot of the people who I see, both like in conversations as well as in Twitter wars, and again, I could be wrong here, but a lot of the people that I happen to see that were pitted up against more of the reactionary angle, a lot of them did tend to be closer to a dog than a person when it comes to the arguments that they were bringing forth, which is, again, why I say I think that there is a lot of comfort in being surrounded by an opposition that is very low on the totem pole of intellectuality, and why I think what BTR is doing and what I encourage everybody to do is actually start having the conversation for once. By that, I mean having the same conversation we're having right now with people who are of a higher tier. And believe me, they're out there.
Yeah, but the problem, like, as much as I agree, the problem is that it really, at this point, it doesn't matter how stupid they are, because obviously, like, bio-Leninism is a thing. The problem is that the stupidest people in the world have immense, I mean, the Joy Reid people, like people who are just like low grade. What does Alex Jones say? These people are low grade morons. They have like immense political power over us. So it doesn't matter that they like contradict themselves all the time, because every elite sort of degenerates after a while. So it doesn't matter that the American Brahmin caste is low digit IQ and they can't, they get owned by people who have like anime avatars all the time. The point being is that when it comes right down to it, who at the end of the day has more power? The anime avatar Groiper, or Groiper 1488, or is it Ilhan Omar or whoever, Joy Reid, whatever her name is, or like Talia Lavin or whatever. Like these people, you know what I mean, Lev? That's my problem.
I think you're ignoring another subset of people, the ones that I mentioned before, other than the Ilhan Omars, because the way that I see it, there are a couple of different forces here.
Like there's sophisticated theory cells that try to argue all the time. But
no, I don't mean that. I mean like people who make the decision. So, for example, there was a comment over here from Yiz who says people who argue this shit on social media are meaningless. They aren't active in reality. Absolutely, which is exactly why I'm saying the people who I want to bring on BTR to talk about a lot of this stuff, I want to bring on the people who are active in reality and do have a certain sway over decisions that are being made. And maybe, like I was talking about before, with like when people of a certain ilk have had enough of whatever is going on, when people have had enough of the Elon Omars and are willing to come on with the Prudentialists and discuss a lot of these things, these are going to be some, I'm not saying all, like Jesse Lee Peterson says, some, not all. But anyway, when it comes to some of these people, I generally think that they are able to be reached out to. And there was no attempt before me. I'm going to say this. I know that this is a very kind of like taking the credit way. I don't care. Fuck it. I don't care. Before I came along, these conversations were not being done in this way. I have the ability to change things. I was sent to this planet. No, they weren't. Not in this way. I was sent to this planet for a reason. You may not know it, but I was sent here for a reason, and I am going to change things, and I guarantee it. This is a guarantee from Left Polyakov, breaktherules.tv. Things are going to be different.
All right. Well, with that,
those viewers are not those of big rules.
Mandate of heaven. Mandate of heaven.
Oh, bring that back. But with that being said, I think that's a good place to wrap up because I know it's 1:15 Eastern time.
Oh, and super chats. You got to do the super chats.
Yeah, I know, Lev. That's what I was going to get to before you start reading them. But with that being said, I think I'm going to have to change. I'll probably have to change the title about a conversation on culture, governance, and meaning. But I'll let me get started with the super chats because there were quite a few. So Lev for $5 and send super chats to the Prudentialists. Thank you very much, Lev. I appreciate it. And then we'll continue on. Armalist Dynat for $10 saying, trying to infiltrate the managerial class is simply trying to use Sauron's ring against him. I haven't yet seen it work. I'm inclined to believe that to a degree. I think trying to infiltrate it, the only way I see infiltration working is if you started being like full-on accelerationist and you started like trying to treat the system like an autoimmune disease and try to get it to attack itself. That would be the only way I see it. But so far, I haven't seen anyone do that to any degree of success. Any thoughts there, gents?
Well, apart from like just sheer incompetence, which, I mean, that happens all the time. I mean, let's face it. I mean, the federal government within the last, I would say, 50 years doesn't exactly have a stellar track record. But that being said, they can sort of insure against petty incompetences through a variety of means. And it would take an immense effort by a number of Machiavellian figures to actually like do like meaningful damage to the system itself. Because it seems that every time the government embraces something disastrous, there's either a workaround from it or the media will just simply cover it up. Like, again, the biggest thing to me that is impeding any progress in our definition of it, in our worldview, is probably the mainstream media. That's probably the thing that has to get Minecraft first, but that's just me.
To me, it's academics.
Yeah, and
I think both are. I mean, think of the amount of money it takes to go to college today. And I really doubt that. And again, it's not something that we could just sit back. I really want to, when I have more money, which is why you have to send me super chats when the left stream starts at 2 o'clock. But when I have more money, I can invest that money into decentralized educational systems. And I can talk with all the rich people and kind of get them on board this thing, because I think they care about, look, you have no idea how many conversations I've had with mothers whose like a daughter ended up going to college, becoming angry all the time, and they've had it up to here.
OnlyFans.
Yeah, well, no, they went to a different direction. They went to the SJW colored hair direction. But we are going to get to the OnlyFans, the Wheel of Fortune. You got to have a Wheel of Fortune, Gio, on your anyway. The bathtub time. But anyway,
Armalist Dynat for holy shit, $50.
Whoa.
Thank you. Wow.
Wow.
I'm not worth that much, but thank you. That'll pay for gas
Yes,
this
you
week when I go
are.
to work. He says, the Gestalt essence of the reactionary analysis is that humans should live according to human nature. It's not about fetishism of the past. That's a midwit criticism of the work done to illustrate in painful detail how power and how society works.
Yes.
Yes, wholeheartedly agree. And there's a big difference between sort of the McTrad fetishism of loving my Lucky Strike commercials and my 1950s suburbia, and those who understand that, you know, humans are naturally hierarchical creatures, that we have these sort of teleological desires to have a life that has greater meaning than just what we do before us. So when I'm at the end of my life, my family and my neighbors can tell me that this man lived a good life by his creed, by his community, and by his faith. And I think that, yeah, it's definitely a midwit argument saying like, oh, you just want to grow carrots and live in your subsistence farm and, you know, McFeudal
Or you hate
land,
women.
or that you hate women, or that you hate X, Y, and Z group. And that's not true. I have no hatred for anybody except for those who wish to destroy things. I have an in-depth hatred for those who are entropic. But no, that is a very good point, Armalus, and thank you again so much. That's a lot of money.
What an amazing super chat. But and I'm just going to push back very slightly because I pretty much agree as far as I don't think that your viewpoint is the trad larper one. But I would say that my issue, which I talked about before, goes back to the actual implementation and to knowing the repercussions of any of these kind of systems were they to be implemented today, or would aspects of them be implemented today. This is something that has to be looked at very carefully when you talk about this stuff. And so my concern again goes back to certain things worked in the past, and maybe these were the best ways of going about society in the past. Can this kind of system even exist now? And what also were some of the things that may have not been looked at as carefully as far as how people live there that we wouldn't want to import? And again, of course, that doesn't mean like, oh, I want to have like premature childbirth, or I want to have like, you know, wife beating and stuff like that. What it comes down to is there may be certain things that are overlooked when it comes to these systems that if they were to, or at least if a tangential form of them was to be implemented, certain things that neither you nor Geo would be in favor for would start to all of a sudden exist. There's no way for me to know specifically what those things would be, but yeah.
But I think we do neglect like that point about human nature. We do kind of neglect the like degree of like immense hatred that the ruling ideology does have for the concept of like human nature itself. Because I mean, you notice like the transhumanist and now the UFO language is starting to enter mainstream discourse. They really do embody like the Donna Haraway phrase from the Cyborg Manifesto, if nature is unjust, then just change nature. Like that's what they legitimately believe, right? So it's sort of a very tricky it's very tricky to like go to the average person now and say to them that you have a deeper essence of human nature about you that you must reconnect with. Because
which aspects of nature though? Because if we are talking about aspects of human nature where people did live more like more animal-like, however you want to define it.
But I'm not just talking. No, but love. I'm not just talking about the material conditions. I'm talking about what makes us human beings and what makes us men and what makes us women. It's not like the material conditions alone.
Even there too, if we're talking about more primitive societies out there, like Aboriginal tribes and so on and so forth, you could say that they live in more of a dream state, kind of like being like the fingers of the hand. So my whole thing is
we
that
don't have that capacity to live collectively the way that they do anymore.
Yeah, no. However, though, I would push back and just simply say that, like, identifying the ideas of a good life, identifying the concept of which, you know, community being a guy that, you know, has an invested interest in his his kids, his neighbors, all that sort of stuff. Like I've talked about this on my channel consistently, is that you need to make yourself, and is easy as it is to fall into that allure of materialism that comes with modernity. If you can push yourself to be that sort of paragon of virtue where you're invested in your kid's school, you are invested in your community, you care about what the hell is going on with your neighbors, people are going to look to you as that example of a better alternative. And to me, I think that that's the aspect of human nature that we're getting into, is that the communitarian, the guy who cares sort of deal. Because there's a Twitter handle I like. His name is Upstate Federalist. He talks about it all the time. He's like, a lot of these problems that you bitch about locally would happen if you actually got your ass out of the couch and went to your local city council meeting and started raising hell. And to me, stuff like that needs to start happening. The localism aspect and the reintroduction of these values will help definitely in the long run. But I'm gonna continue on. Kara Small for $5 says, good to see other artists with my politics. Been orienting myself towards leaning to make a manga recently. Might be a few years, but I'm headed there.
Nice.
That's awesome. I think more.
No, that's degenerate. No anime. Never. No, I'm kidding.
Gio, you recently were reading Berserk.
I am. I can't stop reading Berserk. I'm at like chapter 12 now. I can't believe this.
Wow, this is Babby's first manga.
Yeah,
but everyone needs to make
it's encouraging. Art. Yeah, please go and make that manga. And even if it doesn't see even if it does see the light of day and there's no monetary value in it, just the accomplishment of actually I don't do I'm a fine art person. I don't do serial illustrative occasionally, but I don't do series work like a manga or a comic strip or whatever. And I think that takes an immense amount of time and dedication. Lev, you're an animator, so it's the level of because to me, after I work a certain subject, it gets boring to me. So the thought of doing a whole series or a whole manga is kind of it's above my pay grade, put it that way. So I commend you for it, or anyone that does animation.
Well, I do want to make a stream later on with people from animation and comics, illustration, whatever, some of whom who may be canceled, to talk about this stuff, because I do see the animation community, and I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here because I want to get to the next. Oh boy, that's going to be a fun one. But I do want to emphasize how I do think that the animation community today very different than what it used to be when it comes to the fan base.
I noticed that people, when it comes to even discourses around art, inevitably it's always animation people or people that work in the quote unquote industry. The people that go to art school now, they go for illustration and design and animation. The people that do fine arts, they've sort of cloistered themselves in the professional art world, and they don't really drive the discourse anymore. There is this other wretched Bugman piece of what that was talking about the same old reheated Jacob Geller video about how if you like traditional art, then you're a fascist and you're a shithead. Those people, they're the ones who are driving it, this very grammable kitsch illustration and animation. I think that's unfortunately where the aesthetic discourse is at, and people in the professional art world, they've sort of squandered that, unless you have some kind of monstrosity that people talk about for 5 seconds, like the recent statue at the Rockefeller Center. By the way, tomorrow I'm releasing my Style Talks #5 of Matthew the Stout, my good friend. We're talking about that very statue, and it's going to be amazing because the guy's name is Sanford and Son Biggers. Sanford Biggers. We're going to talk about him and the art world, and it's going to be amazing. On my YouTube channel, by the way.
And last but not least is Amelis Dynot for $5, saying, Weiss and Lindsay will literally join the Red Guard and Minecraft you before admitting the Enlightenment had problems.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. Especially
we'll see about that. No, we're gonna see about that.
I think James Lindsay he'll probably get. He'll probably get put up against the wall, but I don't know.
Yeah, James Lindsay will be on the wall with the rest of us. But and it's funny because James has talked with Curtis about these ideas because James has said he's had conversations with Yarvin, but I'm blocked by him on Twitter, so I don't know the full extent of that conversation.
Wait, why are you blocked? What did you write? Or
he's very thin-skinned.
Taking it's a long story in itself. But yeah, I agree with that entirely. Go ahead.
No, I just want to say quickly. You go ahead. I'm going to say that for
what I was going to say now is that is what appears to be the end of the super chats. And Armalus, thank you so much again. You donated quite a few times throughout today's stream, so I'm very thankful for that. I greatly do appreciate it because all the money, I'm beginning to treat this like a job. So all the cash that I get either from ad revenue or from Subscribestar or now super chats, that goes to paying off medical bills. So I'm a very thankful guy. which I'm appreciative of, because if anyone who's been a follower for a long time knows that I'm currently waiting for that magical phone call when your boy gets a kidney. So thank you very much.
Oh
for
my
making
God,
things
you need a
affordable.
kidney? What happened?
Oh, that's due to a congenital issue. So
well, hopefully you're at the top of the list. No.
oh God, I hope so. I'm only like in my 20s. I have no other health problems.
Yeah. Then you're probably, because if it's a congenital, like, I personally think if you're an alcoholic, I mean, I don't know. I want to have compassion for people who are addicted, but at the same time, it does, like, I mean, come on, a person in their 20s who has no health issues, who has a congenital issue, versus an alkie that's been drinking himself to death for 50 years. I mean, come on, who's going to get that kidney? I don't know.
We'll wait for the phone call, and hopefully I get it soon.
So before we go, it is 1:29, 1:30 at 2:00. So 30 minutes from now, the Lev stream with Bimbo Ubermensch and Sonia supposedly and
God.
Catherine Brodsky and Wired Isotope and Mass Bastard and 718 TV and Geo and myself is going to start. Guys, go there. I see all the 70-something people that are watching this right now. I want to extract all of you and just like bring you into the Lev stream right now. So go there, bookmark it, subscribe.
If you want to hear women talk, go to the left. No, I'm kidding. I'm actually going to be drawing our friend Afina Hayat. I'm going to be doing a pen sketch, and Lev is going to finish one of his NFTs, which I think is a total scam that the art world's going to regret in 5 years' time. But
and also one last thing, subscribe to BreakTheRules.tv. I posted the link there. We are almost at 4,000 subscribers. We are growing strong. This is the mothership. Break the Rules. The Prudentialist has been on it, and we are going to have a stream with. Actually, let me just quickly say that we are going to have a stream that I would have loved Prudentialist to be on, but I know that you can't make it due to time problems. But this is going to be about progress, kind of what we were talking about today. How do you define progress? And we are going to have Samuel Hammond on, who is part of the, he's the director of poverty and welfare policy at the Nixon Center. So Prudentialist, you know what the Nixon Center is, right?
Yep.
So how would you describe it?
I mean, I don't know where to even begin there. But yes, to those who are listening, I am very thankful for Lev and Geo to come on. They've been excellent hosts when I've been over there on BTR. I'm very glad that you guys could come over and have this lengthy conversation to talk about governance, culture, what it means to be reactionary. So with all that being said, if you're interested in these two lovely gentlemen, please go over to the Lev stream. It's on in a half an hour, by all means. Some quick channel announcements before we wrap up today. This next Saturday, I will be with Mr. Patriarch. We'll be doing Prudent Reads. We'll be going over Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince and talking about that excellent work and important piece of literature that everyone should read. And then the next day, the Sunday stream on number 10, will be about neoclassical foreign policy and Russia's grand strategy. I will have Kevin Doremus on. He is an instructor and has a PhD in international relations. It'll be a great conversation, and we'll have a lot going on in the future. I have more scripted works to come and maybe another episode of Real Talk sometime next week. But again, I'm very thankful for Lev and Geo for coming on. If you're interested in anything that these guys do, by all means, subscribe to Break the Rules and go over to Lev's stream as we look about art and get to meet more interesting and weird internet Twitter personalities.
Also, Brittany Venti on Thursday. Thursday.
Oh, God.
Oh, more internet.
And it's going to be with Verse Laloon as well. And James, our good friend James, who runs Women Posting Else.
Yeah.
Oh, even better.
That's going to be a total disaster. It's going to be, there are going to be several people who are going to have to go on lock on their accounts. And no, it'll be fun. I'm sure Brittany, she's pretty on the level from what I hear. So it'll be.
Yeah. And so the last thing I'll ask for all of you guys before I turn off our stream for tonight is be sure that you follow these two lovely gentlemen. But most importantly, if you liked our conversation, if you liked anything that we do, I would appreciate just sharing this content and letting more people know about what I do and who I talk to. We are very close to breaking 2K subscribers. If we can do it by the end of the month, y'all would be amazing. Nice. So more than money, more than your attention and time, let people share it. Let people know about what we're doing. Let people know about the work that I'm doing and the content that I make. I'm turning this into a job. I like what I do. I thought that I wouldn't get this far in just the 6 months of work I've been doing. So with all that being said, just share it, like it, make sure the algorithm doesn't screw us over, because I'd greatly appreciate it.
And like I said, go to my YouTube channel as well. Tomorrow I'm going to have a pretty fire podcast dropping. And go to Prudentialist Subscribe Star. That's another thing.
All of the links are in the description.
Yeah. It's
Excellent.
been a blast, man.
With that being said, thank you both so much for coming on. Lev, I'll hop over for a little bit to watch this art stream and everything going on. And until then, guys, I love you all. Be prudent and have a happy Sunday.
God bless and goodbye.
Take care.